The Nettle River came down out of the broken country to the west with no great reputation for violence, and that was the first lie it told to anyone who chose to settle beside it. For 9 months of the year it lay in its bed like a length of gray ribbon dropped on a table, shallow enough that a boy could cross it barefoot, with his trousers rolled to the knee, slow enough that the cattle stood in it at midday with the flies drifting off their backs, clear enough in autumn that a rider could count the stones on the bottom and mistake that counting for knowledge. It was a river that made men careless, and the country on both sides of it was full of men who had learned to be careless in easier places and had brought the habit west with them the way they had brought their saddles and their opinions. Only in the last week of May and the first weeks of June did the Nettle show what it was, and even then it did not show it in a way that frightened anybody at first, because the rise came slowly, over days, gathering in the high draws where nobody lived and nobody watched, taking on the snow that still lay in the north facing folds of the divide and the rain that fell on ground already full, until the whole of that gathering arrived at once at the low crossing below Tallow Springs, and went through it the color of coffee with cream stirred in and a sound to it like a wagon coming a long way off and never arriving. The crossing was called Cadwell Ford after a man who had used it for 2 seasons and then gone on to Oregon and left nothing behind him but the name, and it was the only place within 11 miles in either direction where a loaded coach could be taken from one bank to the other without a ferry. That fact governed everything else about the place. A town does not grow where the land is good so much as where the road is forced to pause, and the road was forced to pause at Cadwell Ford, so Tallow Springs stood a quarter mile above it on the east bank on a bench of ground high enough to keep its cellars dry, with the whole of its life arranged around the fact of the water below. What made the ford a ford was not luck but a shelf of gravel that the river itself had laid down over a great many years, a bar of washed stone that ran out from the point of the east bank in a long diagonal angling upstream as it went, and joined the west bank a good deal higher than a stranger would have expected. That was the first thing about Cadwell Ford that killed people. A man arriving at the water saw the far bank and drove at it, because a straight line is the shortest way between 2 points, and every man alive believes his eyes before he believes a stranger, and driving at it he came off the gravel within 30 feet and dropped into the chute. The chute lay on the downstream side of the bar, scoured out by the same water that had built the bar, a trough of black water 8 feet deep in a normal year, and more than that in a wet one, and it ran the whole length of the crossing like a ditch dug beside a causeway. In low water the chute was a curiosity that the boys of the town swam in on hot afternoons. In high water it was invisible, because the flood filled both the bar and the chute and made one broad brown sheet of the whole thing, and the only sign of the difference was in the surface, where the water above the gravel broke into low quick riffles, and the water above the chute ran smooth and heavy and slick as poured glass, and the smooth water looked safer to 9 men out of 10. That was the second thing about the ford that killed people, and it had killed 3 of them in 6 years. A freighter named Cudge, who went in at dusk, a boy from the Ostrander place who went in after a hat, and a soldier on furlough whose name nobody in Tallow Springs ever learned, because the army took the body and the paperwork away together and left the town with nothing but the story. There were marks on the crossing for those who cared to read them, and the largest of them was a cottonwood on the west bank that lightning had split some years before the town was there, leaving a white wound down the trunk 12 feet long and a dead crown above it that the crows used. The split cottonwood stood almost exactly at the point where the gravel bar came ashore on the far side, and any man who lined himself on it as he entered the water from the east would have been carried onto stone every time. Almost nobody did. They lined themselves on the road, because the road was where they were going, and the road on the west bank came down to the water 200 feet below the cottonwood, where the bank was lower and the digging had been easier when the county cut it, and so the road itself, the very thing built to carry travelers across, pointed straight into the chute. That was the third thing, and it was the worst of the 3 because it wore the authority of public work. A man will distrust a river. He will not distrust a road. On the bench above the east approach stood the swing station of the Kearny and Northern Stage and Mail Company, and it was the reason there was a town at all, rather than a scatter of claims. The company ran a coach each way on alternate days between the railhead at Kearny Junction and the agencies in the north, carrying passengers when it could get them, and the United States Mail whether it could get passengers or not. And it kept relay stock at intervals of 12 to 15 miles, and the station at Cadwell Ford was the fourth stand north of the railhead and the only one at a river. The buildings were sod at the base and frame above, whitewashed every spring, and they made 3 sides of a yard, the stable with stalls for 16 head and a loft that held 9 tons of hay in a good year. The harness room and smithy where the shoeing was done, and the low long house that held the office, the passenger's room, and the eating house that fed every through coach at noon on the northbound and at 4 in the afternoon on the southbound. Behind the yard were the corrals of peeled cottonwood rails, and the well with its sweep, and the garden, and a stone-lined cellar dug into the bench where the milk and the butter and the winter meat were kept. The station-keeper was Eben Kittredge, 34 years old that summer, a lean, weathered, unhurried man who had come out of Vermont at 19 with a knowledge of horses and nothing else, and who had been at the Ford for 7 years and keeper for 5 of them. He had buried a wife in the 3rd of those years, a small, quick woman named Delia, who had died of a fever in November with the ground already hard, and he had not spoken of her since to anyone except the stock. The town itself amounted to something under 200 souls when the harvest hands were counted, and rather fewer when they were not. There was a Strander's store, which was also the post office, and Mises' Saloon, which was also the hotel, in the sense that a man could sleep on its floor for 2 bits, and Loyal Hames's blacksmith shop, which stood apart from the rest because of the sparks. There was a school that ran 4 months of the year, and a church that was the school with the desks pushed back, served by a circuit preacher who came through every 3rd Sunday when the roads allowed, and less often when they did not. There was a doctor, Fessenden Quirk, who had been an army surgeon and drank in a slow, orderly, unembarrassed way that had never yet cost anybody a limb. There were the freighters who used the Ford with their own wagons, chief among them Dorsey Pruitt, who owned 4 teams and talked as if he owned the country. There was the division agent of the stage line, Junius Ivy, who came up from the junction once a fortnight in a light rig with his account books strapped under the seat, and who regarded the Ford as a line on a schedule rather than as a body of water. And there was the crew of the coach itself, Ott Bevel on the box, who had driven mail in 3 territories and had opinions about all of them, and Truman Sled riding messenger beside him with a shotgun across his knees and a canvas sack of registered mail chained under the seat. That was the place, and that was its arrangement, on the 9th day of June in the year 1878, when the northbound coach came down the long grade out of the sandhills at 11:30 in the morning, with the dust standing behind it and a column that could be seen from the station for 20 minutes before the coach itself resolved out of it. There were 3 passengers aboard. 2 of them were of no consequence to anything that followed. The third was a woman from Ohio, 26 years old, traveling on a through ticket that had been paid for 11 weeks earlier by Eben Kittredge, and her name was Mahala Wren. She had been 11 days getting there, 4 of them on the cars and the rest of them on wheels of one kind or another, and she got down from the coach without waiting for anyone to hand her down, taking the wheel hub with one foot and the ground with the other in a way that told anybody watching that she had been getting into and out of vehicles all her life. She was a large woman. There was no other honest way to put it, and she had never in her life tried to put it any other way. She stood 5 feet and 5 inches, and she weighed, on the last scale that had been asked to hold her, which was the platform scale at a grain house in Zanesville, 281 pounds. She was broad through the shoulder and broader through the hip, thick in the upper arm, deep in the chest, with a round face that went red in the heat and freckled across the nose, and light brown hair pulled back so tightly under a plain straw hat that it made her forehead look higher than it was. Her dress was brown calico, new for the journey and already the color of the road, and it had been cut by her own hands to a pattern that allowed for work. which is to say, the sleeves ended above the wrist and the skirt ended above the shoe, and no fashionable woman in Ohio would have gone out of her own dooryard in it. She had one carpet bag, one wooden trunk with iron corners, and a bundle 6 feet long done up in sailcloth and tied at 3 places with tarred cord, and it was that bundle the men noticed first because it was the wrong shape for a woman's luggage, and none of them could name it. There were 9 of them in the station yard when she came down, and afterward. When the counting of that day had become the settled business of the town, it was always 9, and everybody who had been there could say all 9 names without stopping to think, and everybody who had not been there could say them too. Dorsey Pruitt was there because 2 of his wagons were in the yard waiting on a spare king-bolt from Hames. Loyal Hames was there because he had brought the king-bolt. Wick Tandy, 19 years old and hostler at the station, was there because it was his work to be there. With the fresh team already in the traces and the sweat of the incoming 4 steaming in the sun. Calvin Ostrander had walked down from the store with the mail pouch because the coach carried it, and he had never once let anyone else carry it for him. Ott Bevel was there because he had driven the coach in, and he stayed on his box a moment longer than he needed to, the way drivers do. Truman Sled was down and stretching his back with the shotgun cradled. Harlan Meese had come from the saloon on the excuse of a barrel that was not there. Junius Ivy was in the yard with his account book under his arm because it was his fortnight for the northern stands. And Fessenden Quirk was sitting in the shade of the office wall with his hat over his eyes and a cold cup of coffee beside him, not asleep, because he was never quite asleep. 9 men, and every one of them had something to say, and not one of them had the decency or the wit to wait until she was out of hearing. Dorsey Pruitt said it first and said it loudest, which was his way in all things. He looked her up and down twice, deliberately, so that the looking would be seen, and he said that Kittredge had written off for a wife and the company had shipped him a load and a half, and that he hoped the freight had been prepaid because there was no collecting on that at this end. 2 of the others laughed. Harlan Meese said it was a wonder the thoroughbraces had held, and that he would want to look at the axles before that coach went another mile north. Ott Bevel, who was a proud man about his coach, said mildly from the box that the axles were sound, but that he had wondered on the last grade why the leaders were leaning into it so, and there was more laughter at that. Easy and comfortable. The laughter of men who were all facing the same direction. Wick Tandy, who was 19 and desperate to be included in whatever the older men were doing, said something about needing 2 of the fresh horses just to haul the trunk, and blushed scarlet the moment he had said it, and never in the rest of his life forgave himself for it. Calvin Ostrander did not laugh. He said, in the flat way a storekeeper says a thing he means to be taken as fact, that a woman of that build would not last a winter on a station, that the work was standing work and lifting work and cold work, and that she would be ill by Christmas and buried by spring, and he said it as if he were reading out the price of nails. Loyal Hames, who was a decent man in most weathers, said nothing at all with his mouth and everything with his face, and shook his head once, slowly, and turned back to the wagon he had come to fix, and that shake of the head was quoted afterward more often than any of the words. Fessenden Quirk pushed his hat back and looked at her with a physician's frank appraisal, and remarked to nobody that the heart is a muscle like any other and can only be asked to do so much, and then he tipped his hat forward again. And Junius Ivy, who was the only one of them with any authority over the place, took his pencil out from behind his ear and made a note in his account book, and said to Truman Sled, not quietly, that he would need to look again at the arrangement here, because a station keeper's wife at a swing stand was carried on the company books at $8 a month for the eating house, and the company expected a return on $8, and he did not see the return standing in front of him. Truman Sled, the 9th man, laughed at that. It was not a cruel laugh. It was worse than a cruel laugh, because it was an unthinking one, the small, courteous laugh a man gives his superior when the superior has made a joke and the joke is not funny and something has to be done about the silence. Truman Sled was 28 years old and had a mother in Missouri he wrote to every month. And he laughed at that woman in that yard because Junius Ivy had made a noise that wanted laughing at, and he carried the sound of his own laugh for a great while afterward. Mahala Wren heard all of it. There was no possibility that she had not. The yard was 40 feet across, and the air was still, and the sound of a laugh in that country carried to the corral and back. She stood beside her trunk with her hands folded in front of her, and she looked at each of them in turn, unhurried, not defiantly, the way a woman looks at a row of jars to see which ones have sealed. Then she looked past them to the man who had not spoken. Eben Kittredge had come out of the harness room when he heard the coach, and he had stopped in the doorway with a hamestrap in his hand, and he had not moved since. He was not laughing. He would have said afterward, and did say afterward, more than once, and meant it every time, that he had not laughed and had not thought a laughing thought. But he had not spoken either. He stood in that doorway through the whole of it, through Pruitt and Meese and Bevel and Tandy and Ostrander and Hames and Quirk and Ivy and Sled, with a Hames strap in his hand and his mouth shut, and the silence of the man who had paid her fare and written her 9 letters was louder in that yard than every word the 9 of them had said, and both of them knew it. She waited 3 full seconds after the last of them had finished, which is a very long time, in a still yard, and Eben Kittredge did not feel them. It was Orpha Bevel who broke it, and the town remembered that too. Orpha was the driver's wife, 41 years old, 5 feet nothing, sharp as a hoof knife, and she ran the eating house at the station for the $8 a month that Junius Ivy had just been so free with. She came out of the kitchen door with a pan of water in her hands and threw it across the yard onto the ground in a way that made half the men step back, and she said, loud, that dinner was on the table and getting cold, and that anybody who was going to stand in her yard discussing the weight of a Christian woman could stand there and starve. Then she crossed to Mahala, took the carpet bag out of her hand before Mahala could stop her, and said that she was Orpha, and that there was a basin and clean water in the second room on the left, and that she would want to wash the road off before she ate, because 11 days of it was more than any face should carry. And Mahala Wren said thank you, in a low voice with the Ohio still in it, and went in, and left her trunk and her long sailcloth bundle standing in the dust of the yard with 9 men around them. The trunk went into the small room at the end of the passenger wing, the one with a window that looked south down the length of the crossing, and it was Wick Tandy who carried the end of it, because Eben took the other end, and Wick could not think of a way to refuse without making it plainer than it already was. The sailcloth bundle Eben carried alone, and he was surprised by the weight of it and by the way the weight lay, all at one end, as if the thing were a tool rather than a possession, and he set it in the corner of the room and stood a moment looking at the knots in the tarred cord, which were not knots he knew. Then he went out and stood in the yard and watched the coach pull away north with Ott Bevel's whip cracking over the fresh team and the dust closing behind it, and he stayed there until the dust was down and the yard was empty and there was nothing left to look at, and by then it was too late to say what should have been said in the first 10 seconds. And a man who has missed the first 10 seconds of a thing rarely finds a second chance at them. He had written her 9 letters between the middle of March and the end of May, and she had written him 7, and both of them had kept all of them. That was the whole foundation of the thing, and it was not much of one, though it was more than a good many marriages in that country had under them. The first letter had gone in answer to a notice placed in a Cincinnati weekly by a man in Kearney Junction who made a small business of such notices and took $2 for the placing, and Eben had written it badly, in the stiff, formal, half-apologetic style of a man who has not written a personal letter in 5 years, setting out that he kept a stage station on the Nettle River in the western part of the territory, that he was a widower without children, that the place had a good well and 11 cows and a garden that did well in a wet season, that he was not a drinking man, and that he wanted a wife who was not afraid of work, because there was more work at a swing stand than 1 man and 1 hired boy could carry. He had said nothing whatever about what he hoped a wife would look like, because it had not occurred to him to say it, and because he would have been ashamed to write it down, and because he had honestly believed at the time that he did not care. Her answer had come back in a firm round hand with the letters standing up straight, and it had said that her name was Mahala Wren, that she was 26, that her father had kept a ford and a ferry on the Muskingum in Muskingum County for 31 years, and she had worked it beside him from the time she could carry a bucket, that she could cook for 20 at short notice, keep milk, salt pork, mend harness, shoe in a pinch, though not well, and read water, and that she was not afraid of work, and had never once in her life been afraid of it. She had also written, in the 4th letter, plainly and without any coaxing, that she was a very large woman, and had been since she was 15, that no amount of going without had ever changed it, and she had long ago stopped trying, that she was strong and healthy, and had never been sick a season in her life, and that she was telling him so before he spent money on a ticket, because she had known a girl who had gone out to Kansas on a promise and been sent back on the next coach like a parcel refused. And she would not have that. Not for any man, not for any place. And Eben Kittredge had read that letter in the harness room by lamplight in the last week of April, and had sat with it a long time, and had felt something move in him that he did not examine closely, some small mean flicker of disappointment that he was immediately and properly ashamed of, and he had written back the next morning that he was not a man who bought stock by the look of it, and that she should come. He had written the ticket order the same day. He had not lied. He had simply never asked himself what he would do when the words on the paper stood up in his yard in a brown calico dress with 9 men laughing, and the answer, as it turned out, was that he would stand in a doorway with a hame strap in his hand and say nothing at all. The arrangement, as it had been set out in the letters, was that they would be married when the circuit preacher came through. And the circuit preacher, a fair, tired, conscientious man named Everton, who covered 400 miles of country on a mule, had come through Tallow Springs 3 days before she arrived and would not be back until the last Sunday in June. That left 20 days. Neither of them had planned those 20 days, and neither of them, on the first evening, could have said whether they were a mercy or a punishment. Mahala took the room at the end of the passenger wing, and Eben kept his own room off the office, and Orpha Bevel, who had a house of her own a quarter mile up on the bench, and a husband who was away 3 nights of every 4, moved a cot into the kitchen and slept at the station for the whole of those 20 days without once being asked to, and without once saying why, and dared any man in the county to remark on it. That first evening Mahala ate with Orpha in the kitchen, because the passenger's table was not set on a day with no southbound, and afterward she went out and walked around the whole of the station and looked at everything. She did not touch anything, and she did not ask anything. She looked at the corrals and counted the stock, 16 head in and 4 out on the run north, and she saw that the near hind of the off-wheeler in the second corral was standing pointed and would want looking at. She looked at the hay in the loft and put her hand deep into the stack and drew it out and smelled her palm. She looked at the well sweep and worked it twice. She looked at the garden, which was late and weedy because a man alone in June has 40 things ahead of a garden, and she noted that the beans had been planted in ground that took the afternoon sun full on and would burn in August. She looked into the harness room and saw 31 sets of harness on the pegs, and she saw that 7 of them wanted stitching at the hame strap and 2 wanted new billets, and she saw a stitching horse in the corner with dust on the seat, which told her that the mending was done seldom and in a hurry. She counted things. She had been raised by a man who counted things and wrote the counts down, and she could no more walk through a place without counting it than she could walk through it with her eyes shut. And then she went down the road to the water, alone in the last of the light, and stood on the bench above the east approach and looked at Cadwell Ford for the first time. The river was up, not high, not yet, but up, running a foot or so over its low stage with a color like weak tea and a smell of wet clay coming off it, because there had been rain in the high country in the last week of May, and the country had not finished giving it back. She stood there for the better part of half an hour without moving, and what she was doing in that half hour was the thing her father had taught her before he taught her to read, which was to look at the surface of moving water and say aloud what was underneath it. She saw the long line of low broken riffles running out from the point of the east bank and angling upstream, and she knew before she had been there 5 minutes that there was a gravel bar under it and roughly where it went. because water going over stone in 3 feet of depth breaks in a particular short chop that does not look like anything else in the world. She saw the smooth, heavy slick beside it, running the whole length of the crossing on the downstream side, and she knew there was a trough there and that it was deep. Because water that deep and that fast does not break at all. It only shoulders, and it had a shoulder on it like a hog going through a fence. She saw the road on the far bank coming down 200 feet below the split cottonwood and pointing straight across, and she looked from the road to the riffles and back to the road twice. And then she said a word out loud that her father had used for exactly one kind of thing. Behind her, up the slope, Eben Kittredge stood at the corner of the stable and watched her stand there in the failing light, and he could not for the life of him understand what she was looking at, because to him the ford was simply the ford, a place he had crossed 400 times, and there was nothing to see. He thought about walking down. He got as far as thinking about it. Then Wick Tandy called from the corral about the pointed hindfoot, and Eben went to see to it, and the light went, and the first day ended with the two of them not having exchanged 11 words since the coach came in. To understand what Mahala Wren saw at Cadwell Ford that evening, it is necessary to go back a long way east and about 20 years, to a bend of the Muskingum River below the mouth of Wills Creek, where her father Absalom Wren had kept a crossing from the year he came of age until the year the railroad bridge took his living away from him. It was not a grand establishment. It was a set of stone-paved approaches on both banks, a flat-bottomed ferry scow 40 2 feet long that was worked across on a cable when the water was high, and a hard gravel ford beside it that could be driven when the water was low, and a house with a bell on a post that the far side rang when it wanted him. Absalom Wren was a thin, dry, unsmiling man with an enormous vocabulary of river words and almost none of any other kind, and the central conviction of his life was that a river is not a danger but a text, and that men drown for the same reason men are cheated, which is that they will not take the trouble to read. He had 5 children, and he taught the reading to all of them, but he taught it hardest and longest to Mahala, partly because she was the one who wanted it, and partly because she was the one built for it. She was a heavy child and became a heavy girl, and she was, from the age of about 11, the only one of the 5 who could stand in the tail of the ford in a June rise and not be moved. Her father had explained that to her in plain terms when she was 12. Standing knee-deep on the paving stones with the brown water piling against the backs of her legs, and it was the single most useful thing anyone ever said to her. He told her that moving water does not care how strong a person is, it cares how much of them there is and how they are set on the bottom. He told her that the push of a current goes up with the square of its speed and straight up with the area a body puts in front of it, and that a man's legs put up nearly the same area whether the man is 130 pounds or 280, but his footing does not, because footing is weight pressed on stone. He told her that this was why a big steady man in slow water is safe where a thin quick man is swept, and why an ox stands where a horse swims, and why a child in 18 inches of fast water is in more danger than a grown woman in 3 feet of it. And he told her, because he was an honest man, the other half of it too, that once the water is deep enough to float a person, all of that advantage reverses itself and turns against you, because a heavy body is a slow body in a current, and there is no swimming out of a chute, and that therefore her whole art in life was to know exactly where the bottom was, and to never, ever, under any circumstance whatsoever, step off it. She learned the art. She learned it the way a child learns a language, without being able to say afterward how. She learned that the true edge of a bar shows as a change in the chop, and not as a change in color, and that color lies constantly in flood because the mud is uniform. She learned that a snag makes a boil 20 feet below itself and never above, and that the boil moves upstream as the water rises. She learned to read the far bank for the entry line rather than the near bank, and to pick a fixed high mark on the far side and hold it, and never to look at the water going past her feet while she walked, because the eye takes the moving water for the still thing and the still bank for the moving one, and a person who watches the water at her feet will be on her back in 10 seconds. She learned to carry a pole. Her father's rule was a pole always, upstream, planted, and only 2 of your 3 points moving at any time, exactly as a man goes up a ladder, and the pole she carried, from the age of 14, was a length of second-growth hickory 9 feet long, a shade under 2 inches at the butt, shod at the foot with a socket of iron her father had a smith make, with a cross-cut nick in the shoe for grip, and a series of shallow rings burned into the shaft at each foot from the bottom so that it could be used as a sounding rod as well as a staff. It was that pole, wrapped in sailcloth with 2 spare iron shoes and a coil of tarred cord and her father's brass-cased pocket level, that had come out of Ohio in a bundle 6 feet long that no man in the yard at Cadwell Ford could put a name to. And she learned the last part of it in the worst way there is. Her brother Josiah was 2 years older than she was, a light, quick, laughing boy with a genius for horses and no patience with the text of the river at all. In the April she was 15, a chestnut mare of theirs got out at night and crossed on the ford in low water and was standing on the far bank in the morning with the water coming up an inch an hour behind her, and Josiah went for the mare, and he went the way the road went, which was straight, because he was in a hurry, and he was 17, and it was his mare. Their father was 4 miles off at a mill. Mahala was on the bank with her pole in her hand, and she called out to him twice to go up to the paving, to line on the sycamore, to go up, and he waved at her the way an older brother waves, and he was off the stone within 30 feet, and the water took him around the point and down. And they found him the following afternoon 11 miles below in a drift pile with his hat still on. She was 15 years old, and she had watched it happen from 40 feet away with the right knowledge in her head and a 9-foot pole in her hand and no possible way to reach him. And she never afterward in her life heard a man say that a crossing was fine without a small cold thing turning over in her chest. There was one more piece of it, and it belonged to the years after. When Absalom Wren's Ford was made worthless by a railroad bridge 2 miles downstream, he did not stop keeping the record he had kept every day for 31 years, which was the stage of the water at 7 in the morning and at 7 at night read off a stone in the abutment that he had cut with a chisel into feet and quarters. He kept it until the day he died, and Mahala kept it with him, and the reason he gave for keeping it was the reason she gave later when the men of Tallow Springs laughed at her for it. That a river does not tell you what it is going to do, but a river's own history will, and the only difference between a man who is surprised by a flood and a man who is not is a stick with marks on it, and thee. Patience to look at the stick every day for 4 years. He had a book of it, 31 years of it, a stage reading twice a day, in a hand that got smaller and shakier toward the end, and from that book he could say, in a dry season, what date the rise would likely come and how fast. And he was right often enough that people who had laughed at the book came and asked him about it and then went away and laughed at it again. Her mother had died when she was 9. Her 2 sisters had married and gone to Indiana. Her remaining brother had a shop in Zanesville and no use for the river. Absalom Wren had died in February of 1878 of a thing Dr. Fessenden Quirk would have called an apoplexy, at the age of 63, and the kitchen 3 feet from the door. And Mahala had buried him, and settled the little that there was to settle, and found herself 26 years old in a house that was not hers, with a trade nobody wanted, in a county where every man she had ever known had watched her grow up and had long since decided what she was and was not for. The notice in the Cincinnati Weekly had been read to her by a neighbor woman as a joke. She had gone home and answered it that night. And in the 4th letter, when she wrote out plainly what she weighed and what it meant, she had also written one sentence that Eben Kittredge had read past without understanding and would think about for the rest of his life, which was, I am built the way the work I know needs, and if there is no water at your place, then I am only fat. But if there is water then, I am the best thing you will ever hire. There was water at his place. She had seen that much in half an hour standing on the bench in the failing light, and she had also seen that nobody at Cadwell Ford had ever once read it. She went to work the second morning without being asked and without announcing it, which was a thing Orpha Bevel noticed and approved of before the coffee was made. The southbound was due at 4 in the afternoon and would want dinner for however many it carried, and Orpha found when she came in at 4:30 in the morning that the fire was already going, that the water was already up from the well, and that a large woman in a brown calico dress with her sleeves turned back to the elbow was standing at the table cutting salt pork into a pan with a knife she had brought with her from Ohio, having first sat down and stropped it, because the station knife would not have cut butter in August. By 6 o'clock she had bread rising in 3 pans. By 8 she had been out to the corral twice, and on the second time she had asked Wick Tandy, in a mild voice with no correction in it, whether the off-wheeler in the second corral had been off his feed as well as pointing that near hind, and Wick, who had not thought to look at the horse's feed at all, said that he did not know, and went and looked, and came back and said that the horse had left half his oats 2 feedings running. Mahala said that she had thought so, and asked whether there was a hoof knife about the place with an edge on it. There was not. There was a hoof knife with no edge on it, which is the same as no hoof knife, and so she stropped that too on the same stone, and then she stood in the corral with the horse's near hind between her knees, in a posture that half the men in the county would have said she could not get into and could certainly not get out of, and pared at the sole around the white line until the thing let go and ran, and the horse leaned his whole weight against her, and she took it without moving her feet. Wick Tandy watched her take that weight. He was 19, and he had said the thing about the trunk and the 2 horses in the yard the day before, and he stood there in the corral and watched a woman he had made a joke about stand flat, footed, under 1,100 pounds of leaning gelding, without so much as shifting a boot. And something in him began to come apart quietly, the way a badly made joke comes apart when you look at it a second time. At noon she went into the harness room. She did not ask permission for that either. She took down the 7 sets that wanted stitching at the hame strap, blew the dust off the seat of the stitching horse, sat down to it, and by the time the southbound came in at 10 minutes past 4, she had 5 of the 7 done. With an awl and waxed ends and a 2-needle stitch her father had taught her, 8 stitches to the inch, backed up 3 at the finish, better work by a long way than anything hanging on those pegs. Eben Kittredge came in for a collar at 2:30 and found her there with her mouth full of waxed thread, and did not say anything for a moment, and then said that she did not have to do that. And Mahala took the thread out of her mouth and said evenly that she knew she did not have to, and put it back in, and went on stitching. He stood there a moment longer, and then took his collar and went out. It was, by his own later reckoning, the second chance he had missed, and there would be several more before he stopped missing them. The southbound carried 5 that day, and they were fed at 10 past 4 in the passenger's room off the office, and what they were fed was salt pork with a brown gravy, boiled potatoes, dried apples stewed with a little of the last of the sorghum, hot bread with butter out of the stone cellar, and coffee. It was the same dinner in its parts that the station had been serving for 5 years. It was not the same dinner. Orpha Bevel was a Fairplain cook who had learned in a hurry at the age of 38. Because the money was needed, Mahala Wren had cooked for a ferry landing where 20 teamsters might come off the scow at once in the rain, and every one of them expected to be fed inside 20 minutes, and she had been doing it since she was 13. The difference was not in the receipt. It was in the timing, and the heat, and the order of operations, and in the fact that the bread came out of the oven 11 minutes before the coach was due, and not 40, and in the fact that the gravy had been made from the fond in the pan with a spoon of flour worked in dry first, so that there was not one lump in it. A drummer out of Omaha ate 3 helpings and said aloud, to the room, that he had eaten at 40 one-stage stands between Chicago and the mountains, and this was the best of them, and asked whether the company knew what it had here. Junius Ivy, who was still up on his rounds, and who was eating at the same table because the company fed its agents free, made no answer at all, and did not look up from his plate. The town began to come and look. That was the thing about Tallow Springs, and about every place like it. A new face was an event, and a new face of that size was a spectacle, and for the better part of 2 weeks there was hardly an hour in the day when somebody had not found a reason to walk down from the bench to the station yard. Women came with the excuse of butter to sell and stood in the kitchen door. Men came with the excuse of a strap to be mended and stood in the harness room door. Boys came with no excuse at all and stood at the corral rail until Orpha ran them off with a dishcloth. What they saw, mostly, was a woman working, which was not what they had come for and which disappointed a good many of them. And what they said afterward, mostly, was the same handful of things said in the same handful of ways, which came down to the observation that she was a good worker for her size, as if the size and the work were 2 horses in a race and everybody was waiting to see which won. Cleota Ivy came on the 4th day. She was the division agent's daughter, 22, slight, fair, very neatly turned out for that country, and a gray poplin that had been made in Omaha, and she had been riding out to Cadwell Ford Station on one errand or another for the better part of 3 years, ever since Delia Kittredge had been in the ground long enough for the visits to be decent. Everybody in the county knew what the errands were for, and everybody had assumed, without any particular malice, that the thing would happen in its own time, and the news that Eben Kittredge had ridden off east for a wife had gone through the town in March like a grass fire, and had been laughed about in Mises' saloon for a week, and had not been laughed about in the Ivy house at all. Cleota came into the kitchen with a jar of Kinsey preserve in her hands and put it on the table and said, in a voice as sweet and level as new cream, that she did hope Miss Wren would not find the winters here too much for her. That the wind came off that river in January in a way that got into people who were not used to it, and that a person who felt the cold ought to be careful. Then she looked, once, deliberately at Mahala's arms, which were bare to the elbow and flowered, and smiled with her mouth. Mahala thanked her for the preserve. She said that she had never yet met a winter she could not sit through, and that in her experience it was the thin ones who took the cold worst, and that she would be glad of the Kinsey because the station was short of anything sharp to cut the fat of salt pork, and a spoon of Kinsey in the gravy would answer very well. Then she picked up the jar and set it in the pantry among the working stores rather than on the shelf with the gifts, which was, in the language of kitchens, an answer of considerable force, and Orpha Bevel turned to the stove so that her face would not show, and Cleota Ivy went out through the yard and got on her horse and did not come back for 11 days. On the 6th morning she cut a cottonwood pole 8 feet long out of the brush below the corrals, peeled it white, and spent an hour on the kitchen step with a chisel and a piece of charcoal, marking it off in feet and quarter feet from the butt upward, cutting a shallow notch at every quarter, a deeper notch at every foot, and a notch with a cross above it at every 3rd foot, so that the reading could be taken at a distance without counting. Then she took the station maul down to the water at the toe of the east approach and drove that stake into the gravel of the bank at the exact edge of the low water line, hammering it with short, accurate strokes until 11 inches of it were in the ground, and it stood as solid as a hitching post. And she squatted beside it and read the water against it and stood up and wrote the reading on a slip of paper. It was, that morning, 1 foot and 3/4, which meant nothing at all by itself, and she knew it meant nothing at all by itself, and that was the entire point of driving the stake, because a reading means nothing until there are 400 of them. She set 3 witness marks besides. A stake driven at the water's edge is a stake that will be gone in the first serious rise, and her father had lost 8 of them over the years and had cured himself of the loss by always putting something up the bank that could not be taken. She found a flat-topped boulder half buried 30 feet up the east approach and chiseled a level line across its face and cut the figures for 6 feet beside it. She cut a blaze into the trunk of a box elder at the head of the approach and set a nail in it, and measured from the nail to the top of the boulder mark with a knotted cord, which is a rough method and a perfectly sufficient one. And she took her father's brass-cased pocket level, which was the only thing of any monetary value she owned besides the trunk. and leveled across from the Box Elder blaze to a notch she cut in the base of the split cottonwood on the far side, on a day when the water was low enough to walk, so that she would have a mark on both banks at the same height and could read the river from whichever side she happened to be standing on. All of this took her the better part of 4 days, worked in around the dinners and the bread and the harness, mostly in the hour after sunrise and the hour before dark. The sounding was the long part. She did it in the early mornings with the pole, wading out from the point of the east bank in water that came at first to her boot tops and then to her knees, planting the shod foot of the hickory upstream of her and taking her steps between plants, feeling for the bottom ahead of her and reading the depth off the burned rings on the shaft, and every time she found the shoulder where the gravel fell away into the chute, she set a peeled willow wand in the stones at her feet to mark it. She worked out from the point in a wide arc and then along the bar in short traverses, and it took her 9 mornings. And at the end of the 9 mornings she knew 4 things about Cadwell Ford that no living person had known, including the men who had crossed it 400 times. She knew, first, that the bar was not straight. It ran out from the point of the east bank at an angle of about 30 degrees upstream, held that angle for perhaps 140 feet, and then bent further upstream still, so that a straight line drawn across the crossing lay on stone for the first third and on nothing for the rest, which was precisely why so many men got 2/3 of the way over and then found the world drop out from under a wheel. She knew, second, that the bar came ashore on the west bank at the split cottonwood and not at the road, and that the 70 or 80 feet of bank between the cottonwood and the road was cut and undermined and would not carry a loaded coach up out of the water even if a coach could be got to it. She knew, third, that there was a gate in the bar. About 100 feet out, where an old slough had once cut through, there was a gap 11 or 12 feet across, where the gravel dropped away a full foot lower than the rest, and the stone in the bottom of it was loose and rounded rather than packed. And a wheel that came into that gate at the wrong angle would find nothing under it for a moment, and would slough. And a person walking it who did not know it was there would step down 12 inches into fast water without warning and go over backwards. She marked the gate with 2 wands, one on each side of it. And she knew, fourth and last, that the whole business was hung on one fixed point, which was the split cottonwood, and that anybody standing anywhere on the east bank at any stage of water, in daylight or in the last of the dusk, could put himself on the stone every time by entering at the point and holding that white lightning scar dead ahead of him and never once looking down at his feet. She wrote all of it in a book. She had walked up to Ostrander's store on the 7th day and asked for a blank ledger, and Calvin Ostrander had sold her the smallest one he had, a school copybook of 40 leaves bound in marbled board, and had charged her 60 cents for it, which was full price and a shade over, and had entered the 60 cents in his own daybook in his own careful hand while she stood there. In the copybook she ruled columns with the straight edge of the level, the date, the hour, the stage at the stake, the color of the water, the amount and kind of drift coming down, the weather at Tallow Springs, and a last narrow column she headed simply west, in which she wrote what she could learn of the weather in the high country from anybody who had come down out of it, which meant she asked every driver, every freighter, and every passenger off every coach twice a day, whether it had rained where they had come from and how hard and for how long. Ott Bevel thought she was making conversation and answered her civilly for 3 days before he understood that she was writing it down. The town made a joke of it inside a week, and the joke had a life of its own for the whole of that June. Dorsey Pruitt was the author of most of it. He said in Mises' saloon and repeated it in the store, and said it once to her face across the corral rail that Kittredge's woman was down at the river counting how much water there was because she was afraid there would not be enough of it for her to wash in. He said that the stake she had driven was so she would know when the river came up to her knees, and that at that rate the flood would have to be 20 feet. He said that she was measuring the ford to see whether she would fit through it. Harlan Meese, who kept a slate behind the bar for the settling of bets, opened a line on how many days it would be before the woman gave up her river business. And there was $2.40 on that slate by the middle of the month, and not one of the entries was more than 11 days out. Wick Tandy did not bet. Loyal Hames did not bet either, but when Mahala came into the smithy on the 14th day with the iron shoe off the foot of her hickory pole, worn thin at the nick and split at the socket from 9 mornings of gravel, Loyal Hames took it out of her hand without a word, looked at the workmanship of it for rather a long moment because it was good work, and he knew good work, drew a piece of stock and made her a new one heavier than the old, with a deeper cross cut in the face and a longer socket, fitted it hot so the wood took the burn and gripped, quenched it, handed it back, and refused her money twice, and turned away and began to blow up his fire again so that there would be no need for either of them to say anything further. He did not defend her in the saloon that night when Pruitt started in. He did not say a word in the saloon at all. But he had made the shoe, and he had made it heavy, and a man does not put that much iron and that much care into a tool he expects to see thrown in a corner. Eben Kittredge said nothing about the stake, the wands, the level, or the copybook, except once on the 11th evening when he came out to the corral and found her at the rail writing in it by the last of the light and asked her what she had there. She told him, the stage of the river, morning and evening, since the 10th. He asked what good that was. She said that it was no good at all yet, and would be a great deal of good in 4 years, and some good in 4 weeks. He looked at the book and at her, and said, "Do what you like, it is company ground, but nobody has ever wanted it," and went in. And she wrote the evening reading and closed the book and stood a while at the rail in the dark listening to the sound the river made, which had changed a little in 11 days, and which almost nobody at Cadwell Ford but her would have been able to say had changed at all. Eben Kittredge spent those weeks in a condition he could not have described and did not try to. He was not an articulate man about anything that happened above his collarbones. He could tell a stranger in 90 seconds everything worth knowing about a horse he had never seen before, and he could not have told his oldest friend one true sentence about his own first marriage. Delia had been small. That was the fact that lay under all of it and would not be moved. She had been small and quick and easily tired, and she had weighed perhaps 105 pounds, and he had liked to put his hands around her waist because he could. And she had died in November of 1874 of a fever that came out of nowhere and took 9 days about it, and he had learned in those 9 days that there is a particular helplessness in watching something small get smaller. He had not remarried for 3.5 years, not because he was faithful to a memory, but because he had been afraid of the whole subject, and when at last he had written to a stranger in Ohio, it was in the deliberate, practical, almost commercial way that a man who is afraid of a subject goes at it. A station wants a woman. Here are the terms. Please reply. And she had replied, and had told him the truth in her 4th letter, and he had thought when he read it that he was better than he was. That was the sting of it. He had genuinely believed, sitting in the harness room in April, that he did not care what a woman looked like, and he had discovered in a yard in June, in about 4 seconds, with 9 men watching, that he cared a good deal, and that what he had cared about was not even her, but them, and what they would think of him, and whether Dorsey Pruitt would say the thing that Dorsey Pruitt in fact said. That was a smaller and meaner discovery than a man wants to make about himself at 34, and Eben Kittredge went around with it for 11 days like a stone in his boot before he did anything about it at all. What he did instead, in those 11 days, was watch, and the watching was the thing that saved him. He watched her get up under a leaning gelding and not move her feet. He watched her make 31 sets of harness into 31 sets of harness that a man could trust, which nobody had done at that station in the whole of his keeping. He watched her feed 19 people off a stove that had never fed more than 11 well. He watched her take Wick Tandy, who was a good boy and a bad hostler, and turn him in 3 weeks into a boy who looked at feet and looked at feed and looked at the sweat pattern under a collar, and she did it without one word of criticism, entirely by asking him mild questions to which he did not know the answers, so that he went and got them himself, and believed he had thought of it. He watched her stand out in the river to her knees at 6 in the morning with a stick in her hands, while men who could not have told you within 4 feet how deep their own crossing was made jokes about it in a saloon. And somewhere in the middle of those 11 days it came home to Eben Kittredge that he had written east for a wife and had been sent, by whatever agency arranges such things, a better hand than he was, and that he had stood in a doorway and let 9 men laugh at her. The woodpile was where he finally said it, and it was the 12th evening. He was splitting for the kitchen, because the kitchen went through a shameful amount of wood now that there were 3 meals a day going out of it instead of 1, and she came out to carry the split, which she did in an armload that would have staggered Wick Tandy. And he set the axe head down on the block and held the helve and said her name, and then had to start twice. He said that he had stood in the door of the harness room on the 9th and had not opened his mouth. He said that he had heard every word Pruitt said and every word Ivy said and had not opened his mouth. He said that a man ought to be able to give an account of himself, and he could not give one, that he had not laughed and had not agreed and had thought all of it was low, and that none of that was worth a cent because he had said nothing, and that saying nothing in front of 9 men is the same as saying it with them, and he had known that at the time. He said that he was ashamed. He said that if she wanted to go back east on the southbound, he would pay the fare, and there would be no word said against her by him, ever, anywhere. Mahalo Ren stood with an armload of split cottonwood against her chest and let him get all the way to the end of it. Then she said that she had been looked at by men in yards since she was 15 years old and had a system for it, and that the system was to wait and see which ones were still looking the same way in a month. She said that she had not come out here for a man who was quick. She said she had come for a place with water at it, and that the getting of a husband, which she would not pretend was nothing, was a thing she intended to decide about with her eyes open the way she decided about everything else. And then she said the part that he carried afterward, which was that his silence in the yard had not hurt her the way he thought it had. That what had hurt was 3 seconds later, when she had looked at him and given him the 3 seconds and he had not taken them, and that she had stood there and thought, well, he is not a cruel man, he is only a coward in company, and there is no help for that but time. She said it without heat. She said it the way she said that the near hind wanted paring. And Eben Kittredge stood at the block with his hand on the axe helve and took it, which was the first genuinely creditable thing he did in the whole business. Then she shifted the armload and said that if he was truly ashamed there was a way to be less so, which was to come down to the water with her in the morning at 6 and let her show him his own crossing, because he had told her he had been over it 400 times, and she was prepared to bet the whole of her 60-cent copybook that he could not say within 4 feet how deep it was 30 steps from where his own coaches went in. He came in the morning. He could not say within 4 feet. He guessed 5, and it was 10.5 in the chute at the stage the river was then. And she showed him the wands standing in the gravel with their peeled tops out of the water in a long curving line that bent upstream like a drawn bow. And she made him stand at the point of the east bank and sight on the split cottonwood. And then she made him stand where the road came down on the far side and sight back. And he saw for the first time in 7 years that the 2 lines were not the same line and were not close to it, and that his coaches had been crossing 400 times on a line that lay on stone for the first third of the way over and on the shoulder of the chute for the rest of it, and that the only reason nobody had been killed at his stand was that in 9 months of the year the chute was shallow enough that a slewed wheel came out again. He stood in the water to his knees beside her, a lean man in soaked trousers, and looked at the line of willow wands going away from him upstream, and he said, after a while, that he had thought the bar went straight across. And Mahala said that everybody thought that, and that thinking it was going to cost somebody. and that the whole of her business at Cadwell Ford from that day forward was to see that when it did cost somebody there was one person on the bank who knew where the stone was. On the 22nd of June, the river stood at 3 feet and 1/4 on her stake, which was 1.5 feet above where it had been when she drove it. And Dorsey Pruitt came down to the ford with a heavy wagon and 6 mules carrying 60 sacks of flour consigned to the agency store 40 miles north, and lost 22 of the 60 in 11 minutes. She had warned him. That was the part the town chewed over afterward, because there were 4 witnesses to it and no possible argument about what had been said. He had stopped at the station to water, and she had come out to the corral rail with her hands still floury, and had told him, civilly and without any air of instruction, that the water was better than a foot up on the low stage, and that the line he used was wrong at any stage, and would be dangerous at that one, that there was a gate in the gravel about 100 feet out where the stone went a foot lower and ran loose, and that if he would come in at the point rather than at the road and hold the split cottonwood, he would be on hard bottom the whole way. She had offered, in the same voice, to walk his leaders across for him herself. She said that she had done it for her father's customers for 11 years, and that it cost nothing and would take 4 minutes. Dorsey Pruitt was 46 years old. He owned 4 teams outright and a house with a shingle roof, and he had a young man's terror of being made to look foolish that had never once left him. He was being watched by Harlan Meese, who had walked down to see the wagons go over, by Wick Tandy at the gate, and by his own driver on the second wagon, a boy of about 17. He laughed. He said that when he wanted a woman to lead his mules, he would put an advertisement in the paper, same as Kittredge. He said that he had been over that ford before she was born, which was not true, and was not even close to true, and that the flour was his, and the wagon was his, and the mules were his, and the river had never yet asked his permission for anything, and he had never yet asked the rivers. Then he took his hat off to her, elaborately, and put it back on, and drove down the approach and turned his leaders at the road line and went straight at the far bank. It happened almost exactly the way she had told him it would happen, which is the most infuriating way for a thing to happen. The first 60 feet were fine, because the first 60 feet were on the shoulder of the bar, and would have been fine for a locomotive. At about 100 feet the near front wheel came into the gate and dropped a foot into loose stone, and the wagon lurched left and the tongue swung, and the 2 leaders felt the pull come across their necks and did what mules do, which is to try to get their heads around toward the trouble. That put them quartering across the current, and the current at 3 feet and a quarter had weight in it. The rear axle came off the stone next. The whole load, 60 sacks of flour of 100 pounds apiece, shifted 11 inches to the downstream side, and the wagon went over onto the shoulder of the chute and lay there half-canted with the brown water piling against the box and coming in over the sideboards, and the near-wheel mule was pulled off her feet and went down in the traces with her head under and the collar holding her there. What followed was 3/4 of an hour of the sort of work that men remember with a good deal more satisfaction than it deserves. Loyal Hames came down from the shop with chains and a snatch block. Eben brought 4 horses off the corral. Wick Tandy rode out along the bar with a rope and got a line onto the tongue, and did it well, because he had been shown where the stone was on the 12th morning by a woman with a stick, and had been going down to look at the wands on his own time ever since. They cut the drowning mule out of her traces with a knife on a pole, which is a thing nobody does gracefully, and got her head up, and she scrambled onto the gravel and stood on the bar, shaking with her hide running water, and lived, which was a good deal better than she had any right to expect. They snubbed the wagon to a cottonwood, took the load off it, sack by sack, in water to their armpits, and dragged the empty box back onto the bar and up the east approach with 6 horses at 11 o'clock at night by lantern light. 22 sacks of flour had gone into the water and been in it long enough to set. Flour that has been wet through and dried is not flour. It is 100 pounds of stone in a sack, and the agency store would not take one of them. At $3 the hundredweight, that was $66, which was more than the station's eating house earned in 8 months, and Dorsey Pruitt paid it out of his own pocket because it was his own freight, and he was a long time forgiving anybody for it. Not himself. That was the thing. He never once, in the whole of the rest of that summer, said in any company that he had been warned. He said that the ford had gone bad. He said that the county ought to be made to do something about the crossing, that a hole had opened in it in the spring rise, that a man could not be expected to know a river had changed under him overnight. He said it in the store, and he said it in Mises, and he said it to Junius Ivy when Ivy came up on his rounds, and by the middle of July there were men in Tallow Springs who honestly believed that a hole had opened in Cadwell Ford in 1878. And the belief was a comfortable one because it excused everybody. Mahala Wren heard the story going around and wrote in her copybook, on the 24th, in the narrow column at the end, the words, "Gate not new, stone in it is old and rounded, been there 20 years. And she said nothing to anyone about it, except to Eben. And to Eben she said only that a man who will not admit he was told will be told again by somebody with less patience than she had. There was one small consequence that mattered. The boy on the second wagon, Pruitt's driver, a thin, quiet 17-year-old named Ossie Halloran, who had not been asked his opinion of anything by anybody in 4 years, came to the station kitchen door 2 days later with his hat in his hands, and asked Mahala whether she would show him where the wands were, because he had to cross that ford 11 times a month, and he did not intend to go into the chute for anybody's pride. She took him down at 6 the next morning and walked the line with him twice, out and back, and made him do the third crossing alone while she stood at the point and watched, and gave him her father's rule about the fixed mark on the far bank, and told him the thing about not looking at the water at his feet. Ossie Halloran crossed Cadwell Ford at the point and on the Cottonwood for the next 19 years, and taught it to 2 of his own sons, and it is worth setting down that the first person at Cadwell Ford to take Mahala Wren seriously was not the man who had sent for her, nor the men who had laughed at her, but a hired boy of 17 who had watched a mule nearly drown and had drawn the obvious conclusion. There was a reason the coaches went over that crossing on a bad line at any stage of water and never waited. And the reason was written on paper in Washington and copied into a book that Junius Ivy carried strapped under the seat of his rig. The Kearney and Northern held the mail on Route 34,158, from the railhead at the junction to the northern agencies on a 4-year contract at $9,400 the year, 3 trips each way weekly, schedule fixed to the hour. The contract said what all such contracts said. For a trip failed without sufficient cause, the department deducted the whole pay of the trip and might, at its pleasure, add a fine of up to 3 times that amount. For arrival late without sufficient cause, the deduction was proportioned to the delay, and the phrase sufficient cause was not defined anywhere in the document, which meant in practice that it was defined by a clerk at a desk 1,800 miles away who had never seen the Nettle River and never would, and every contractor in the West understood perfectly well that high water was a cause that clerk had been known to accept and had also, more than once, been known to refuse. That was the arithmetic of Cadwell Ford, and Junius Ivy carried it in his head the way another man carries a grudge. A trip laid over one day at the Ford cost the company the value of that trip and put the following 2 out of step and risked the whole month's return. A coach that went in and got over cost nothing. A coach that went in and did not get over had never yet happened on his division, and he had accordingly stopped considering it, in the way that men stop considering the thing that has not happened yet, which is the oldest and most reliable method of arranging a disaster. Mahala went at him with a proposal on the 26th of June, 4 days after the Pruitt wagon. She had it worked out on 2 pages of her copybook with figures, because she had been raised by a man who had learned that no argument about a river is ever won by describing the river. The proposal was this, that the west approach be moved. The road came down to the water 200 feet below the split cottonwood and pointed into the chute. The bar came ashore at the cottonwood. Between the cottonwood and the road the bank was 8 to 11 feet high, cut and undercut, and would not carry a loaded coach. But 40 feet above the cottonwood there was an old buffalo trail, cut through the bank at a natural slope, and a crew of 6 men, with 2 scrapers and a team, could open that to a road width of 14 feet in 2 days, grade it, brush the face of it, and set a snubbing post at the head, and then a coach could enter at the point on the east side, hold the cottonwood the whole way across on hard stone, and come up out of the water on a made grade. She had measured the cut with the knotted cord. She reckoned the work at 2 days for 6 men and a team, which at the going wage came to something under $40. And she wrote at the bottom of the second page that 22 sacks of flour had already been paid for at once. Junius Ivy read the 2 pages, standing in the station office with his thumb in his account book, and handed them back and said that the approach was a county road and not company property, that the company could not spend $40 improving a county road because the auditors would disallow it, and had disallowed exactly such an item at the Loop Crossing in '76, and that if the citizens of Tallow Springs wanted a better approach they might petition the commissioners who met at the county seat in September. He said it without any particular unkindness. He said it as a man states a rule. Then he said the other thing, which was less excusable, which was that he had been over that ford himself on 11 occasions in a light rig and had never found any difficulty with it, and that in his experience a crossing that gave trouble to a freighter was generally a crossing that had been given trouble by the freighter. And then he put his pencil away and asked Orpha Bevel what there was for dinner. Eben tried it from his own side and got no further. He wrote to the county commissioners, and the letter went south on the 28th, and the commissioners met in September as advertised and referred the matter to the road overseer of the 3rd District, who was a farmer 11 miles east with a hay crop to get in. He spoke to Calvin Ostrander about getting a subscription up in the town, $40 among 11 or 12 men being no great matter, and Ostrander said that he would put his name for $2 if others put theirs first, which is the classic way of putting one's name for nothing. He spoke to Dorsey Pruitt, who used the ford more than any other man alive, and Dorsey Pruitt said that what wanted doing was for the county to fill the hole that had opened in the spring, and that he was not going to pay to move a road that had been perfectly good for 6 years, and that if Kittredge wanted to spend $40 on his wife's notions, he was welcome to spend it. And there the matter sat, on the 29th of June, with the river at 3 feet and a half and rising a little every day, and a made road on the west bank pointing squarely into 10 feet of water. The other thing that came into the station in the last week of June was a child, and the child mattered a good deal to what happened afterward. Her name was Effie Prine, and she was 8 years old, the daughter of Orpha Bevel's younger sister, who had married a clerk in the Indian Service and gone north to the agency 2 years before. Effie had been sent down to her aunt at Tallow Springs in the spring while her mother was ill, and the arrangement was that she would go back up on the northbound coach in the 2nd week of July when her mother was well enough to have her. And in the meantime she lived at the station and was, in the way of a lively 8-year-old among adults with work to do, entirely in everyone's road. She attached herself to Mahala within 4 days, and she did it with the flat, unembarrassed logic of a child, which was that Mahala was the only person at Cadwell Ford who answered questions in full sentences. Effie asked why the water was brown. She was told about clay and about the difference between a river carrying its own bed and a river carrying somebody else's field. She asked what the sticks in the water were for, and was taken out to the point at 6 in the morning and shown, with her hand in a hand twice the size of her mother's, exactly where the stone was and exactly where it was not, and she was made to say it back, and then made to say it back again 3 days later, and then again, until she could stand on the east bank and point at the split cottonwood and say the whole of it without prompting, "Come in at the point, hold the white tree, never look down at your feet." Effie Prine was 8 years old and could recite the line of Cadwell Ford before the end of June, which was more than the division agent of the Kearney and Northern Stage and Mail Company could do, and more than 8 of the 9 men who had stood in the yard on the 9th. The circuit preacher, Everton, came into Tallow Springs on the Saturday evening on a mule with a sore shoulder, and they were married in the schoolhouse on the last Sunday morning in June, with the desks pushed back against the walls and the door standing open because of the heat. She made her own dress, and made it in 9 days out of a length of blue-gray wool delaine that Calvin Ostrander had carried on his shelf for 2 years without selling, because the color was not what the country wanted, and which he let her have at a reduction that surprised her and surprised him rather more. She cut it plain, and she cut it to fit, which meant she cut it to a shape that no pattern book in Ostrander's store allowed for, and she did the whole of the fitting on herself with pins and a small-looking glass and a great deal of patience, and Orpha Bevel, who could not cut but could sew, put in the seams. On the morning of the wedding, Orpha came into the little room at the end of the passenger wing with a collar of Irish lace folded in tissue that had been her mother's and her grandmother's before that, and pinned it at Mahala's throat without asking whether it was wanted, and stood back and looked, and said that she would do, and then went out quickly into the yard and stood by the well sweep for a minute with her back to the house. The town came. Nearly the whole of it came, and it is no kindness to the town to pretend that most of them came for the reason people generally come to a wedding. They came to see it. There had been 3 weeks of talk in Mises and in the store and over 11 fences, and a good half of Tallow Springs wanted to see with its own eyes the moment when Eben Kittredge stood up in front of a preacher beside the woman the coach had brought him, and to see what his face did. His face did nothing. He stood up in a black coat that had been his father's and was a size too large in the shoulder, and he said his part in a voice that carried to the door, and he did not once look at the room. Cleota Ivy came, in the gray poplin, and sat in the 3rd row, with her hands in her lap and her chin level, and afterward she shook Mahala's hand and said all the correct things in the correct order, and she was, to be fair to her, never afterward heard to say a low word about the marriage, though she said a good many about the country and left it in October for a position in Omaha, and married a man in the wholesale grocery line, and by all accounts did well. Dorsey Pruitt did not come. Harlan Meese came and stood at the back with his hat on until Orpha took it off his head for him. Loyal Hames came in a clean shirt with his hand scrubbed to the wrist and the black still in the creases, and sat where he could not be seen, and left before the eating. Wick Tandy came and was too shy to speak to anybody, and had brought, and could not think how to present, a horsehair hatband he had plaited himself over 11 evenings, and in the end he left it on the seat of the buckboard where she would find it, which she did, and wore, and kept for the whole of her life. Calvin Ostrander came and stood in the aisle afterward, and, in the flat voice of a man reading a price, took out of his pocket a slip of paper on which was written the sum of 60 cents, and tore it in half, and gave her the halves, and said that the copybook was a wedding present, and he wished them joy. It was as near as Calvin Ostrander came in his life to an apology, and Mahala understood it perfectly and thanked him for it seriously, and never once mentioned it afterward, not even to Eben. There was dinner in the station yard on planks laid over barrels, and there was a good deal of it, because Orpha and Mahala had been cooking for 2 days, and the eating was general and cheerful, and lasted until 4 in the afternoon. And near the end of it Eben Kittredge stood up on the step of the office with a tin cup in his hand and made a speech, which was the last thing anybody in that country expected of him, and which was 4 sentences long and cost him more than the coat. He said that on the 9th of June there had been 9 men standing in that yard when the coach came in, and that he could name every one of them and expected they could name themselves. He said that he had stood in the harness room door and had not said a word for any of it, and that he had thought about that failure every day since, and did not intend to be quiet a second time. He said that his wife had been in that country 3 weeks, and in that time had mended 31 sets of harness, fed something over 400 passengers, taken a quarter crack and an abscess out of 2 of the company's horses, and gone into the river every morning with a stick until she knew more about the crossing below them than the whole town of Tallow Springs put together. And then he said the fourth sentence, which was the one that was repeated and repeated and repeated for the next 40 years in that county, and which was not fully understood by more than 4 people in the yard when he said it. He said, "Whatever you all thought you were looking at on the 9th, what came off that coach, was the best hand on this river, and you have not seen her work yet." There was a scatter of applause, mostly from the women. Harlan Meese said something to the man next to him behind his hand, and the man laughed, and Truman Sled, who had come in on the northbound the previous afternoon and had stayed over for the wedding out of a vague, unexamined feeling that he owed somebody something, saw the laugh and did not join it, and felt a good deal better for not joining it than he had expected to. Junius Ivy shook Eben's hand and said that a station keeper's wife who could cook like that was worth $8 a month of anybody's money, and thought he had paid a compliment. That night the wind, which had been in the northwest for 11 days and dry, went round into the southeast, and came in warm and heavy off the plains with a smell of wet dust in it, and the sun went down behind the divide into a bank of cloud, the color of a bruise, that stood up 11,000 feet and flickered along its base all night without a sound reaching Tallow Springs at all. Mahala Kittredge went out at 10 o'clock in her nightdress with a shawl over it and walked down to the bench above the crossing in the dark and stood there listening, and came back and wrote in the copybook by the lamp, in the narrow column at the end, 3 words that she underlined: lightning, west, all night. Then she blew out the lamp. She had been married 9 hours. The readings in the copybook for the first 9 days of July are the plainest account of what happened at Cadwell Ford that exists, and they were written by a woman who had been keeping such a column morning and evening since she was 11 years old. On the 1st of July, the stage at the stake stood at 3 feet 6 in the morning and 3 feet 7 at night, and the water was the color of weak tea, and the drift coming down was grass and bark. On the 2nd it stood at 3 feet 9 and 4 feet, and there had been 1 1/4 inches of rain at Tallow Springs itself in the night. On the 3rd it went to 4 feet 3 and held there all day, and Mahala wrote in the margin, studied, and underlined it, because a river that rises and then studies has finished with one supply and has not yet been reached by the other, and her father had a saying about it that she had heard 300 times, which was that the first rise wets the ground and the second rise kills the man. On the 4th of July there was a picnic on the bench with a flag and a barrel of lemonade and a foot race, and the river came up 11 inches between the morning reading and the evening one, and the drift changed. She noticed it at the 7 o'clock reading and stood at the stake for 20 minutes watching it go by. In the morning the river had been carrying grass and bark and the small trash of banks. In the evening it was carrying wood. Whole cottonwoods came down with their root plates turned up and their crowns dragging, going by at the speed of a trotting horse, turning over slowly as they went. A fence rail came down with the end split white and fresh. A hen coop came down. Half of a plank sluice box came down, tumbling, and that one she wrote about at length, because a sluice box means a mining camp, and the nearest mining on the Nettle was 92 miles up in the head country, and half a sluice box in the water at Cadwell Ford meant that 92 miles away something had come out of a draw hard enough to take a man's work out of a creek bed and start it downriver, and that whatever had done it was on its way. The color changed, too, which was the thing she trusted most and the thing nobody else could see at all. The Nettle, in an ordinary rise, ran the gray-brown of the clay banks along its middle course. On the evening of the 4th it began to carry a distinct red in it, a dull brick tone that she had to hold a white saucer against the surface to be sure of, and the red came out of the upper fork, where the country was iron-stained, 40 miles above the forks, in a watershed that did not contribute 1 gallon to the Nettle in an ordinary June. When the upper fork ran, the Nettle at Cadwell Ford got a rise it did not get in any other year, and the last time the upper fork had run, as she learned by asking, was in 1867, 11 years before, when there had been no town at Tallow Springs and nobody to write anything down. She asked everybody. That was her method, and she never varied it. She asked Dot Bevel, coming down from the north, whether it had rained up his way and how long. She asked the drummers. She asked a party of 4 freighters out of the West Country on the 5th, who told her that it had rained on the head of the Nettle for 4 days and 4 nights without a break, and that the little creek at the Sand Hollow stand, which a man could step over in June, had taken out the corral. She asked a surveyor's chainman on the 6th, who said the divide was running white in every draw. She wrote every answer in the narrow column with the man's name against it, and on the evening of the 6th of July, with the stake reading 5 feet 1 and the water red and full of wood, she closed the copybook and went and found her husband in the harness room and told him that the crest of the biggest rise the Nettle had made in 11 years would come down on Cadwell Ford between the 8th and the 10th, that it would carry the ford under by 3 or 4 feet over the bar, that the chute would run 20 feet deep and 11 miles an hour, and that no coach and no wagon and no man on a horse should go into that water on any account whatever until it fell, and that the fall would take 4 days from the crest. Eben Kittredge believed her, without one question. That is worth setting down plainly, because it was the only thing he was able to contribute to the whole affair, and he contributed it completely. He went the same evening to the town and told Calvin Ostrander and Harlan Meese and Loyal Hames what his wife had said, in her words with the readings, and asked them to pass it. He wrote a letter to Junius Ivy at the junction and sent it south with Ott Bevel on the 7th, setting out the stage readings for 9 days, the change in the drift, the red in the water, and the recommendation of the station keeper at Stand 4 that the northbound trip of the 9th be laid over at Cadwell Ford until the river fell, on the ground that no coach could be got over. The town received it about as well as towns receive such things. Calvin Ostrander said that he had lived on that river 6 years. Harlan Meese put a new line on his slate. Dorsey Pruitt, told of it in the saloon, said that the woman had been measuring that river with a stick for a month, and had now got to prophesying with it, and that he had 4 wagons going north on the 9th, and they would go north on the 9th. Ott Bevel, who was a good driver and a proud one, took the letter and put it in the mail pouch, and said to Eben, not unkindly, that he had brought the mail across water that would swim a horse 11 times in his life, and had never yet laid over, and that he did not intend to begin at his own wife's station. And Mahala, who had said her piece to everyone who would hear it, and had been believed by exactly one man, a hired boy, a child of 8 and a blacksmith who would not say so out loud, spent the 7th and the 8th of July doing the only thing left to her, which was to get ready. She had Loyal Hames make 2 more iron shoes for the hickory pole and a 4th for a spare. She cut 9 new willow wands and stripped them. She had Wictandy sink a cottonwood post 6 feet into the ground at the point of the east bank and tamp it, a post 11 inches through and standing 4 feet out, and she snubbed a turn of rope around it herself to test it and hung her whole weight on it, which was a test few posts in that county had ever undergone. She brought out of the station stores a coil of 5/8 hemp rope, 140 feet of it, and worked it soft and spliced a proper eye in one end over the whole of an evening and laid it in the harness room where the door was. And on the evening of the 8th of July, the stake at Cadwell Ford read 7 feet 4, and the willow wands were gone, and the split cottonwood on the far bank stood with brown water running past the roots of it for the first time in 6 years. The 9th of July, 1878, was a bright day. That was the thing everybody afterward found hardest to convey to people who had not been there, and the thing that made the story sound, in the retelling, like a lie. There was no storm at Cadwell Ford. There had not been a drop of rain at Tallow Springs in 3 days. The sun came up out of a clear sky at 20 minutes to 5, and by 9 in the morning the light was so hard and white off the water that men on the bank had to stand with their hats pulled to the brow, and the meadowlarks were going in the grass along the bench, and the air was warm and smelled of dust and horses. The whole of the weather that mattered had happened 90 miles away 4 days earlier, in a country none of them had ever seen, and had been coming down the river toward them ever since at about 4 miles an hour, and it arrived that morning under a blue sky in front of an audience. Mahala read the stake at 10 minutes past 5 and could not read it, because the stake was under, And so she read the chiseled line on the boulder 30 feet up the approach, and the water stood 4 inches over the 6-foot mark, and by the level she had run in June that made the crossing 8 feet 1 inch above low stage. She wrote it in the copybook. Over the bar where the coaches went, there was 5 feet of moving water. In the chute, where the road pointed, there was better than 18. The surface across the whole of it was one continuous brown sheet with no riffle anywhere on it, because the bar was drowned too deep to break the water, which meant that the single most useful sign at Cadwell Ford, the one thing that told a stranger where the stone lay, had been erased at exactly the hour it was needed. The northbound came in at 20 minutes past 8 with 4 passengers, and the change of team was made in the yard as it always was. And the coach stood in the sun with its lettering bright and the mud of 200 miles dried gray on the wheels. Ott Bevel was on the box. Truman's sled was beside him, and under the seat, chained to a ring bolt, was the registered sack for the agency, which that week carried the quarterly annuity money and bank paper to the amount of $4,000, a fact that Truman Sled knew, and Ott Bevel knew, and Junius Ivy knew better than either of them. The passengers were 4. Pell Gaddis, a drummer in the hardware line out of St. Joseph, 52 years old, stout, cheerful, with 2 sample cases. Rhoda Ambler, 24, going up to take the school at the agency in September and traveling early to see the country, a small, dark, serious young woman who had been reading a book the whole way from the junction. A stock buyer named Harkey who had come aboard at stand 3 and who said almost nothing all day. And Effie Prine, 8 years old, in a starched pinafore, with her hair done that morning by her aunt in a way that had made her cry, going north to her mother. Junius Ivy had come up from the junction on the 7th in his light rig, having read Eben Kittredge's letter, and he had come up specifically because of it, and not in the way the letter had hoped. He had come up because a station keeper who recommends a layover is a station keeper who is preparing to charge the company for one, and because he had a route inspection due in August and no intention of carrying a failed trip on his division into it. He walked down to the water at 7 that morning with Eben and looked at it for 4 minutes and said that he had seen the loop higher than that in 74 and coaches over it. He was not lying. The loop had been higher, and coaches had gone over it on a ford that was straight and hard and 800 feet wide with no chute in it anywhere. They gathered on the east bank at 9:15, and the whole town came down to see, because a coach crossing high water is the best free entertainment there is. Dorsey Pruitt was there with 3 wagons drawn up on the approach waiting to follow the coach over, on the Sound Freighter's principle that the man ahead of you finds the hole. Harlan Meese was there. Calvin Ostrander was there. Loyal Hames was there, standing apart, with a chain over his shoulder that nobody had asked him to bring. Wick Tandy was there, holding the leaders. Fessenden Quirk was there with his bag, because Mahala had gone to his door at 6 that morning and asked him to be on the bank at 9, and he had asked her why. And she had told him, and he had come. And Mahala Kittredge was there, in the brown calico, with her sleeves turned back, and the hickory pole in her hand, and the coil of hemp rope over her shoulder, and she said her piece one final time in front of all of them. She said that there was 5 feet of water over the gravel and 18 in the chute. She said the road line went into the chute and had always gone into the chute, and that at any stage under 4 feet a coach that took it slewed and came out again, and that at 8 feet a coach that took it would not come out. She said that if the trip had to be made, then it could be made, but only one way: enter at the point, not at the road. Hold the split cottonwood dead ahead, and never let the leaders' heads come off it. Drive at a walk, and let her go in at the bits and walk them, because the leaders would swim the last 30 feet, and a swimming horse follows a hand better than a rein. She said the last part twice. She said it was 4 minutes' work, and she had done it 11 years for her father's customers and had never lost a team. Ott Bevel said, from the box, in a perfectly friendly voice, that he had been driving mail since '66, and that no man had ever led his leaders, and no woman was going to start. Junius Ivy said that the trip would be made on schedule, and that he would be obliged if everybody would stand clear. And Dorsey Pruitt, who could never in his life leave a silence alone, said loudly to the general company that he was glad to know the fort had got so bad that it would take 300 pound of Ohio to hold the coach down. 6 men laughed, not all 9. The counting of who laughed at that particular joke on that particular morning became a matter of some delicacy in Tallow Springs afterward, and the honest number is 6. Loyal Hames did not laugh, and Fessenden Quirk did not laugh, and Wick Tandy did not laugh and went red to the ears. Orpha Bevel brought Effie down to the coach with her bundle. Mahala took Orpha by the arm at the wheel and said, "Lo," that the child should stay. She said it once, plainly, and Orpha Bevel stood there with her sister's letter in her apron pocket, saying that the fever had broken and to send Effie up on the 9th, and with her own husband on the box of that coach, saying it was safe. And she made the decision that a great many people make and that she never entirely got out from under, which was to do the thing that had been arranged. She lifted Effie up to Pell Gaddis's hands. The door shut at 9:22. Ott Bevel let the brake off, swung his leaders down the approach, and put them into the water at the road line, because that was where the road went. The east approach came down to the water 90 feet below the point, because that was where the digging had been easiest when the county cut it in 73, and from the foot of that approach the far road on the west bank lay almost exactly straight across. It is important to understand that Ott Bevel was not being reckless by the standards he had been given. He was doing what the road told him to do, and what he had done between 200 and 300 times, and for the first 80 feet the road was right, because the flank of the bar came down under the approach and gave good bottom, and the 4 horses went into their bellies and leaned into it, and the water came up over the hubs and slapped along the boot, and everybody on the bank made the noise that people make. At about 90 feet the coach began to lean. That was the bar bending away northward under them, as it had bent since before there was a county, angling upstream toward the split cottonwood, while the coach went straight, and the effect of it was that the whole vehicle slid gradually off the shoulder of the gravel into deeper water on its downstream side, so slowly at first that Ott Bevel corrected for it with the reins as though it were mud. The near-wheeler Bell lost bottom first. She went from walking to swimming in the space of 1 stride, and the swing of her going down took the pole over, and the pole took the leaders' heads around, and Ransom and Pilot, who had been holding a line they did not like at all, came round quartering to the current with their ears flat. Then the whole of it went at once. The rear wheels came off the gravel, and the coach, which had weighed something over 2,000 pounds empty and had 4 passengers, 2 men on the box, the mail, and 400 pounds of baggage in the boot, did what a coach does when it is no longer standing on anything, which is to float for perhaps 4 seconds and then swing. It swung downstream, broadside, with the water piling against the upstream panels, and it went into the chute. The chute at 8 feet of stage was a moving thing 18 feet deep and something over 40 feet wide, running at a speed that men who fished that river argued about afterward, and that was probably between 9 and 11 miles an hour. And it took the coach and the 4 horses and everything on and in them, and carried the entire assembly 150 feet downstream in about 11 seconds. Ott Bevel went off the box on the second lurch. He said afterward that he had been reaching for the brake, which was a lie he told to preserve something, and the truth, which Truman Sled never contradicted, was that he had stood up. He went into the water on the downstream side, and he was 51 years old and could not swim a stroke. What stopped them was the tail of the bar. The chute did not run on forever. It was a scour trough dug beside the gravel by the same water that had built the gravel, and like all such troughs it closed at its lower end, where the bar hooked around under the current and shoaled up again into a wide, low tail. On that tail, 3 days earlier, a cottonwood had come down out of the high country with its whole root plate turned up, and had grounded, and had caught a second tree, and then a mass of brush and rails and 1 drowned steer, until there was a drift pile 40 feet long and 8 feet high lodged across the foot of the chute like a rake set across a gutter. The coach came down the chute broadside and struck that drift pile at the head and stopped dead, and the river climbed the upstream side of it at once and stood 11 inches higher there than everywhere else and poured through the windows on that side and out through the windows on the other. Inside the coach, that was the worst 11 seconds anybody aboard ever spent. The stock buyer Harkey was thrown across and broke 2 ribs on the doorframe. Pell Gaddis, who was a stout man and slow, got wedged and was of more use for it than he would have been loose, because Rhoda Ambler came down onto him instead of onto the sill. The brown water came in on them to the height of the seats in the time it takes to say 4 sentences. And then the coach stopped and lay canted with its downstream side low, jammed against the roots of a tree that had grown 90 miles away and did not go any further, and everybody in it understood at once that the not going any further was the only thing between them and the rest of the river. Truman's sled got out of the near window and up onto the roof with the strap in his hand. And then he did the thing that made his name in that county, which was that he stayed there. He lay along the roof rail on his belly with his legs braced in the baggage rail and reached down through the window and hauled Pell Gaddis out and up by the collar and the seat of his trousers, and then Harkey, gasping with his ribs, and then Rhoda Ambler, and then he reached down for the 4th time and could not find the child. Effie Prine had gone under the seat. She had gone there in the first lurch, the way an 8-year-old goes to the smallest place there is, and she was wedged in the well of the coach under 2 feet of moving brown water, holding on to the seat frame with both hands, and Rhoda Ambler, who was 24 years old and weighed 102 pounds and had spent the whole journey with her nose in a book, went back in through the window head first, with Truman's sled holding her ankles, and got the child by the arm and got her out. It took, by the watch of the men on the bank, about 40 seconds, and Rhoda Ambler swallowed a good deal of the Nettle River doing it and coughed for 2 days. So at 9:26 in the morning on a bright day with meadowlarks going in the grass, the situation at Cadwell Ford was this. A mail coach lay 150 feet below the crossing and something over 200 feet out from the east bank, jammed against a drift pile at the foot of the chute, canted, with the water pouring through it and the roof standing about 30 inches clear. On that roof were 5 people: Truman's sled, Pell Gaddis, Harkey with his ribs, Rhoda Ambler, and a child of 8. Under the seat, chained to a ring bolt and under water, was $4,000 of government money. 20 feet downstream of the coach, in the drift pile itself, Ott Bevel was hanging in the branches of a cottonwood with his left arm broken above the elbow and his chin barely out. And below the drift, standing in 4 feet of water on the tail of the bar, tangled in 180 pounds of harness and holding each other up, were 4 horses. One of them, the near leader pilot, already down on his side with his head being held under by his own collar, and on the bank, in the sun, stood the town of Tallow Springs. For 50 minutes the town of Tallow Springs did everything that could be thought of by men who had never in their lives been taught to think about water, and every one of the things they thought of failed, and 2 of them nearly cost lives. They began with rope, because everybody begins with rope. Loyal Hames had his chain, and there were 4 coils in the wagons, and Eben brought the 140 feet of 5/8 hemp from the harness room. The coach lay 210 feet out from the bank as they measured it afterward with a chain, and 150 of it below the crossing. And the best throw any man in that county could make with a wet line was about 60. Wick Tandy tied a hame ring on the end of a light line for weight and got 71 feet out of it and put his shoulder out doing it. Then they tried the thing that would have worked on a lake, which was to float a line down. They lashed the line to an empty nail keg at the point of the east bank and set it off, and the keg went down the chute like a shot bird, and the line paid out singing off the coil. And the drag of the water on 100 feet of submerged hemp built up in about 4 seconds to a pull that no 2 men could hold. And the keg passed 30 feet wide of the drift pile because the current at the foot of the chute set outward toward the west, and then the line came up hard and bellied downstream into a bow and tore itself out of Harlan Meese's hands and took a piece of Loyal Hames's palm with it. They tried it twice more. It went wide both times, and further wide the second time. And after the third try, there was 140 feet of good hemp rope lying somewhere in the river below the island, and the coil in Eben Kittredge's hands was the only long line left on that bank. Then they tried horses, which is what men in that country tried when rope failed. Wick Tandy was 19 and would have gone into anything for anybody that morning. And he had a bay gelding of the company's that could swim, and he put the light line around his own chest with a bowline, because Loyal Hames stood in front of the horse and would not move until he did, and he rode down the approach and put the bay into the water at the road line. The bay had bottom for 40 feet. Then it had none, and a swimming horse in an 11-mile current does not go where it is pointed. It goes downstream at 11 miles an hour while making about 2 miles an hour of its own in whatever direction its head happens to be, and the horse and the boy went down the chute together and passed the coach at a distance of some 50 feet, and Truman's sled on the roof screamed at him to let go of the horse. And Wick Tandy, who had that much sense at least, let go of the horse. They dragged him back to the bank on the line, over the shoulder of the bar, 60 yards of it, and he came out on his hands and knees on the gravel of the approach with the water running out of him. And he had gained nothing at all except a permanent and total conversion to the opinions of Mahala Kittredge. The bay swam out below the island and came ashore on the west bank 3/4 of a mile down, and was found that evening grazing, and was the only creature in the whole affair that had an easy morning. Then Dorsey Pruitt went in on foot, and that was the part of it the town talked about longest, because it was the part that made everything afterward impossible to argue with. He had said what he had said on the bank at 9 o'clock about 300 pound of Ohio, and he was a man of 46 who stood 5 feet 10 and weighed 174 pounds, and he was in his own way brave. He took a coil over his shoulder and went down the approach and waded out. At 30 feet the water was at his thigh, and he was leaning upstream into it and going well, and there was a sound from the bank that was almost a cheer. At 50 feet it was at his hip. And at about 55 feet, on hard flat gravel with both boots planted, in water that stood 4 inches above his belt, the Nettle River picked Dorsey Pruitt up off the bottom the way a woman picks a cat off a chair, without effort, without warning, and turned him over, and he was 30 yards downstream on his back before anyone on the bank had shut their mouth. They got him on the line, which he had at least had the sense to tie, and he came out on the gravel further down with his shirt off one shoulder and blood on his chin from the drift, and he lay there on his elbows and vomited river water. And when he could speak, the first thing he said, in the hearing of 11 people, was that a man could not stand up in it, and the second thing he said was, God help them. Nobody can get out there. It was, on the plain physics of it, the truest thing Dorsey Pruitt ever said. He had gone into moving water 4 feet deep at something over 9 miles an hour. Water that deep and that fast puts a push on a standing man of a good deal more than his own weight, and his footing is nothing but his weight pressed on stone. And 174 pounds of freighter with 2 boots on gravel had no more chance of holding his place than a hat. Every man on that bank weighed within 30 pounds of what Dorsey Pruitt weighed. The whole assembled manhood of Tallow Springs stood there in the sunlight and understood, all at once and for the first time in their lives, that the river was not something they were failing to be brave enough for. It was something they were the wrong size for. Fessenden Quirk, who had been standing at the water's edge with his bag between his boots the whole time, said what a doctor says. He said that the young woman on the roof was holding the child out of the wind of the water with her own body and would not be able to do it for another 2 hours. He said that Ott Bevel had been in the water in the drift with a broken arm for 50 minutes, and that a man of 51 loses heat in a river even in July, and that when Bevel stopped shouting they would have perhaps 20 minutes and then he would let go. And Mahala read the boulder. She had gone up the approach twice while the men worked and squatted at the chiseled line, and the water had come up 2.5 inches in the first half hour and 3 in the second, which is a rise of 6 inches an hour, which meant that the roof of the coach, standing 30 inches clear, would be under before 3 in the afternoon. And it meant something worse and sooner, which she said out loud to her husband and to nobody else. Because there was no use in it going any further, the drift pile that was holding the coach was itself only aground, and it had settled 4 inches in the last 10 minutes with a noise like a barn door. And when the water came up far enough to float the root plate of that cottonwood, the whole pile would lift and go down the river, and everything in it and against it would go with it. She was already sitting on the gravel at the point of the east bank, taking her shoes off. What she did first was take off her skirt, and the town of Tallow Springs never forgot it. She sat on the gravel at the point with the pole across her knees, and she pulled off her shoes and her stockings, because a bare foot grips wet gravel and a smooth boot sole does not, and then she stood up and unhooked the brown calico at the waist and stepped out of it and handed it to her husband, and stood there in her shift and her petticoat in front of 30 people in the full white. Sunlight of 9 minutes past 10 in the morning. Then she gathered the petticoat up between her knees and drew it through and tied it there at the front with a length of tarred cord out of her pocket, so that she was rigged from the waist down in something like a pair of loose trousers, and she did that for the same reason that a man takes his coat off before he swims, and it was the single most practical act performed at Cadwell Ford that day. Because a skirt in a 9-mile current is not cloth, it is a sail, and it would have had her off her feet in 20 feet of walking. Somebody on the bank made a sound. Fessenden Quirk turned around and looked at whoever it was in a way that ended the matter permanently. She would not take a line on her body, and she said why in one sentence to Loyal Hames, who had tried to put one round her, that a rope tied to a person in a current does not save them, it holds them stationary in moving water and puts them under and keeps them there, and that her father had cut 2 men loose from their own safety lines in his life and only got one of them back. What she wanted instead was every rope on that bank bent together into one line, and Loyal Hames and Calvin Ostrander and Harlan Meese and Pell Gaddis's own sample straps and the well rope off the sweep and the 2 picket ropes out of Pruitt's wagons, and the light line Wick Tandy had been dragged in on, all went into it, and Loyal Hames tied every knot himself, sheet bend after sheet bend, wetting them and setting them with his boot, and they made 310 feet of it, and the shore end went round the cottonwood post that Wick Tandy had sunk 6 feet into the ground at the point in June because a woman had asked him to. And Hames put his log chain and a hook on it for a strop, and that post and that chain held everything that happened afterward. Then she went out into the Nettle River with a 9-foot hickory pole and a coil over her shoulder, and she did not go toward the coach. That was the thing that made the men on the bank shout at her, because the coach lay 150 feet downstream, and every instinct any of them had said to go down the bank and out. She went up. She walked in at the point and turned upstream on the diagonal, out along the drowned bar toward the split cottonwood on the far shore, away from the wreck. And for the first 80 feet of it, she was going further from those people with every step. And Junius Ivy said aloud that the woman had lost her head. She had not. She was the only person within 400 miles who knew that the bar and the drift pile were the same bone, that the gravel she was standing on ran out upstream, hooked around the foot of the chute at its lower end, and came up again as the tail where the cottonwood had grounded, and that there was a road of stone from the point of the east bank to the head of that drift pile, 300 feet long instead of 210, on which a person of the right build could stand the whole way, with 18 feet of chute running on her left hand for every step of it. She went the way her father had taught her, and she never once varied from it. The pole went in upstream and was set, and she made her weight over her feet and moved one foot, and then the other, and then the pole, so that 2 of her 3 points were on the bottom at every instant, exactly as a man goes up a ladder. She faced upstream and moved sideways so that the water met her edge on and not broadside. She did not look down at her feet, not once in 300 feet, because a person who looks at moving water at their own feet takes the water for the still thing, and the world turns over and they are gone. She looked at the split cottonwood while she was going out, and at the upturned root plate of the drift when she came down, and both of those things were fixed to the ground, and so was she. The water was at her knees for the first 40 feet, and at her hips at 80, and just above her waist at 120, and she was, by the frank arithmetic of it, carrying 281 pounds pressed down on a wide bare foot on packed gravel, and the river could not get it. Dorsey Pruitt had gone over at 55 feet in less water than she was standing in at 120, and he was on the bank watching her do it with river water still coming out of his nose. At 104 feet, she came to the gate. She had marked it in June with 2 willow wands, and the wands were long gone, and she found it by count and by the feel of the pole, which came down into loose rounded stone a full foot lower than the packed bottom on either side. 12 feet across, a foot deeper, and the current squeezing through it faster than anywhere else on the crossing. The water in the gate came to the bottom of her ribs. She took 90 seconds to cross 12 feet. She went square to it, short steps, the pole planted downstream of her for once, because in the gate the danger was not being pushed over, but being lifted. And she came up onto the packed gravel on the far side of it, and stood there a moment and let her breath come back, and then went on and turned down along the shoulder, around the hook, and came at last, at 22 minutes past 10 by Fessenden Quirk's watch, into the slack water in the lee of the drift pile, where the river was cut in half by 40 feet of jammed cottonwood, and a person could stand in 3 feet of it and be still. She took Ot Bevel out of the branches first, because he had stopped shouting 11 minutes earlier, and Quirk had said what that meant. He was hung in the drift with his broken arm through a fork, and his chin at the water, and his eyes half shut, and she got a hand into his collar and one under him and brought him out of that tree and onto the tail bar and stood him against the root plate in the slack and put his good arm through a loop of the cord and told him he would live if he held on and would not if he did not. He held on. He was on his feet in 3 feet of water in the lee of the pile for another 40 minutes, and he lived, and he never afterward in 11 years of driving said one word in any company about who ought to lead whose leaders. Then she brought the line ashore, so to speak. She signaled with the pole, and Eben and Hames paid the 310 feet of bent rope out along the bar to her, hand over hand, keeping it up out of the water as best they could, and she took the end of it and made it fast around the root plate of that cottonwood with 2 round turns and 2 half hitches, and Loyal Hames took up the slack at the post and set it with the chain. And there was a handrail 300 feet long lying across the Nettle River on a road of stone that nobody but a fat woman from Ohio had ever known was there. Then she went and got them off the roof. She waded to the upstream side where the coach lay jammed with the water climbing 11 inches up its panels, and she reached up and took Effie Prine down first out of Rhoda Ambler's arms and set the child on her own back with her arms around her neck, and lashed her there under the arms with the tarred cord and knotted it across her own chest so that both her hands were free. Then she brought the other 4 down one at a time onto the tail bar into the slack, Rhoda Ambler and Pell Gaddis and Harkey with his broken ribs, and last of all Truman Sled, who would not come until the other 3 were down, and who took the woman's hand coming off the roof of that coach and could not look at her. The walkout took 38 minutes for 200 feet, and every one of those minutes was spent doing one thing, which was keeping 5 people who could not stand up in that river from finding out that they could not. The handrail did most of it. A taut line at chest height changes the whole business for a person of ordinary weight, because it gives them a second point that is fixed to the ground, and with the rope in both hands and their feet under them, and their body edge onto the current, Rhoda Ambler and Pell Gaddis and Harkey and Truman Sled could work themselves along the bar hand over hand in water at their waists at a speed of about 11 feet a minute, and did. Mahala led them off the tail of the bar, around the hook, and up the shoulder to within 20 feet of the gate, and there she stopped them and made them wait in a row, holding the line, facing upstream, and she went on ahead alone, with the child on her back. At the gate she turned and put her back to the current and her feet apart on the loose rounded stone in 5.5 feet of water, on the downstream side of the rope, and planted the hickory pole behind her at an angle with the iron shoe wedged into the packed gravel at the lower lip, and set her shoulder against it, and stood there. Then she called them across, one at a time. That was the whole of it, and it was the thing that 174 pounds could not have done for anybody. Rhoda Ambler came across the 12 feet of the gate, hand over hand on the rope, and at the 4th foot the bottom went out from under her exactly as it had been going to, and the river took her legs and streamed her out flat downstream on the surface with her hands locked on the line, and she came against Mahala Kittredge's body broadside and stopped there. She stopped there the way water stops at a wall. And she got her feet down again against the back of the woman's legs and worked herself along the line across the front of her and came up onto the packed gravel on the far side and stood there shaking. Then Harkey, who could not lift his right arm because of his ribs and who came across on one hand and did it badly, and who went under twice and came up against the wall both times. Then Pell Gaddis, 52 years old and 210 pounds, and he was the worst of them, because he had the most surface and no wind, and he was pinned against her for a full 10 seconds with both his hands off the rope, and afterward in St. Joseph he told that part of the story for the rest of his life and was not believed. Then Truman Sled, who came across last of the able men and who stopped in the middle of the gate in the worst water in the county, with his hands on the rope and the current at his chest, and said something to her that nobody else heard, and she said, "Go on. You are in my light." Then Ott Bevel, with Sled taking him from the far side and Mahala's hand under his broken arm, and that took 4 minutes on its own. And while she stood in the gate, the drift pile settled again, further this time, and swung a foot downstream with a long, tearing groan that came across the water and stood every hair up on the bank. And the coach went over another 6 inches with it, and the roof was down to a hand's breadth of the surface. Effie Prine, lashed to her back with tarred cord, with her chin on the woman's shoulder and her arms round her neck, said into her ear, in the small, flat sing-song of a child reciting, "Come in at the point, hold the white tree, never look down at your feet." Mahala Kittredge said, "That is right," and went on standing in the gate until the last of them was over. She crossed it herself last, with the child, and led them all up the shoulder and along the bar and into the point at 11 minutes past 11 in the morning. And the men on the bank hauled them up the gravel one after another, and Fessenden Quirk went to work on the bank with his bag. And Orpha Bevel came down the approach at a dead run and took Effie Prine, still lashed by the cord to another woman's back, into her arms, cord and all, and had to be cut free of her with a knife. Then Mahala Kittredge drank a dipper of water, and looked at the boulder mark, and said that the pile would not hold another hour, and turned around and went back into the river for the horses. They tried to stop her. That is the part that ought to be recorded properly. Eben Kittredge, who had believed everything she had ever told him about that water, put his hand on her arm and said that it was 4 horses. Junius Ivy said, with his hat in his hand for the first time that morning, that the company would not ask it, and that he would write it up as a total loss himself. Dorsey Pruitt said, horse, that she had done enough. And she said the only hard thing she said all day, which was that they were the ones who had put 4 horses out there, and that she was the one who could go and get them, and that she had watched a thing drown in a river once already and did not intend to do it twice. Truman Sled gave her the key to the padlock on the ring bolt and told her where the chain was made fast under the seat, and she went out the long way again, up the diagonal, across the gate, down the hook to the drift, in 26 minutes, and she went to the coach first, because the coach was going to go and the horses were going to keep. She went down into the flooded body of it through the upstream window with the water pouring past her, got the padlock, got the sack, and came up with $4,000 of the government's annuity money in one hand and the leather mail pouch for the northern agencies in the other, and she carried both up onto the tail bar and slung them across the withers of the off-wheeler, Cobb, and lashed them there with a stirrup leather. The horses had been standing in 4 feet of water for 2 hours and 10 minutes, tangled in their own harness, and the near leader Pilot was down. He had been down the whole time with his head up only because the drift had held his collar and he had got a forehoof over a root, and he was very nearly finished. She cut him out. She cut the traces and the hame straps with Loyal Hames's knife and got the collar off over his ears under water, working by feel, and then she put the butt of the hickory pole under his shoulder and levered against the root plate and got his head up and his 4 feet under him. And a horse that gets his 4 feet under him will do the rest himself, and he did the rest himself. Then she coupled the 4 of them head to tail with the cut straps, Ransom leading, then Pilot, then Bell, then Cobb with the money on his back, and she took Ransom by the near bit ring, and she walked them out. It took 40 minutes. Twice on the shoulder a horse lost the bottom, and swam for a few strides and came back to it, and the whole string checked and swung and had to be brought straight again. In the gate, where the water went to 5.5 feet and there was nothing under a horse's foot but rounded stone, Pilot lunged. He had had enough of that river to last him, and he came up out of the gate in a rush with his shoulder into Mahala Kittredge's back and 1,100 pounds behind it. And there was one moment there, at 28 minutes past 12, in front of the entire town, when a woman went down on one knee in 5.5 feet of moving water with a horse on top of her. She did not go over. She got the pole down, and she got her weight square, and she came up off that knee with the horse still coming and put her shoulder into his neck and turned his head upstream and made him swim it out beside her, and the string came through the gate one after another and up onto the packed gravel of the bar. She led 4 company horses and the United States mail and $4,000 in bank paper up the east approach at 11 minutes past 1 in the afternoon on the 9th of July, barefoot, in a petticoat tied between her knees, with her hair down her back and a 9-foot hickory pole in her hand, and the town of Tallow Springs stood on the bank in the sunshine and did not make a sound. At 10 minutes past 2, the drift pile lifted off the tail of the bar and went, and the coach went with it, rolling, and was found 4 miles down against a cutbank the following week with the boot torn off. Nothing whatever was in it. There were 9 men in the station yard on the 9th of June when the coach brought her, and every one of the 9 was on the bank at Cadwell Ford on the 9th of July, and the town of Tallow Springs was never afterward able to stop counting them, and this is the account of what the 9 did with the rest of it. Ott Bevel had his arm set that afternoon by Fessenden Quirk on the planks in the station yard and carried it crooked ever after. And he drove the Northern Mail for another 11 years, and in the whole of those 11 years he did not once take a team into high water at Cadwell Ford without sending up to the station for Mahala Kittredge to walk his leaders. And he paid her nothing for it, because she would not take anything, and he brought her instead, from every town on the line, every scrap of information he could get about rain in the high country, which she wrote in the narrow column at the end with his name against it. Truman Sled went south on the 11th with the mail and the money and a written report, and he went on riding messenger for 4 more years, and then took a place with a bank in Kearney Junction and married and had a family. He told Eben Kittredge, a long time afterward, at a funeral, what it was he had said to her in the gate with the water at his chest and both her arms out and his hands on the rope, and it was this, that he was the one who had laughed at her in the yard on the 9th of June. And she had said, "Go on. You are in my light." He said that he had thought about that answer every week of his life and had never got to the bottom of it, and that it was either the most forgiving thing or the most contemptuous thing ever said to him, and he had come round at last to believing that it was neither, and that the plain fact was that the woman had been working and he had been standing in her way. Wick Tandy stayed at that station for 19 years and ended as keeper of it. He learned the crossing from her in the way an apprentice learns a trade, morning after morning with a pole, and he could sound a bar and read a chute and tell the age of stone by the round of it, and when she was old he took the readings for her. And when she died it was Wick Tandy who went down at 7 that evening and read the stake and wrote it in the book in his own hand because he could not think of anything else to do about it. Loyal Hames made her, in the autumn of that year, without being asked, and without a word about why, a cast iron gauge plate 3 feet long with the feet and quarters raised on it in the casting, and set it into the face of the boulder on the east approach with 4 lead-set bolts, and it was still legible in 1928. He never in his life said to her that he was sorry for having shaken his head in the yard. He shod her poles for 30 years and would not take money for one of them. Calvin Ostrander got the subscription up. He did it in 4 days in August, and he put his own name at the head of it for $10, which was 5 times what he had offered in June, and there were 31 names on that paper before he was finished, and it came to $84, and the new approach on the west bank was cut through the old Buffalo Trail 40 feet above the split cottonwood in 2 days by 11 men with 2 scrapers and 4 teams, 14 feet wide, graded, with the face brushed, and a snubbing post set at the head. Ostrander kept that subscription paper in the store's safe for the rest of his life. Dorsey Pruitt's name is on it for $25, which was the largest single sum, and Dorsey Pruitt furnished both scrapers and 3 of the 4 teams, and worked the whole 2 days himself with a shovel in the bottom of the cut. And he never once said that he was sorry either. Not to her, not to anybody, and he never again in his life told the story about the hole that had opened in the ford in the spring rise, and when a stranger in the saloon in '81 began to say that the crossing was a bad one, Dorsey Pruitt told him that the crossing was a good one, and that the man who had used it wrong for 6 years was sitting on that stool. Arlen Meese wiped his slate. There was $2.40 on it in June against her giving up her river business inside 11 days. And there was rather more than that on it by the 9th of July on other questions, and he took the whole of the money out of the drawer and walked down to the station with it in a tobacco tin and put it on the kitchen table and went out again without saying 11 words. Then he had a card printed at the junction with the stage of the Nettle River on it, and for 9 years he wrote the morning reading on a slate by his own front door every day, copied from her book, so that any freighter coming into Tallow Springs could see the river before he saw the whiskey. Junius Ivey wrote the report of the 9th of July himself, and wrote it honestly, which was more than his own interest required. He set out that the trip had been ordered made by him personally against the recommendation of the keeper at Stand 4. That the keeper's recommendation had been founded on a written record of river stage kept twice daily since the 10th of June by the keeper's wife, and that the mail, the registered matter, the $4,000 in annuity funds, the 4 company horses, and every soul aboard had been brought out of the water by that same woman, alone, on foot. The department at Washington accepted high water as sufficient cause for the failed trip, which they were not obliged to do. The company paid her $100 in November and entered her on the books of the division at $25 a month as keeper of the crossing at Stand 4, a position that had not existed anywhere on that line before and existed at 4 other river stands within 2 years, and Junius Ivey never afterward passed through Cadwell Ford without walking down to look at the gauge plate. And once, in 1883, in front of witnesses, he laid over a coach at that stand for 2 days on her word alone, and the water came up 11 feet. And Fessenden Quirk set an arm and 2 ribs, and dosed a boy for river water, and sat up that night with Ott Bevel, and afterward he wrote out a full account of the whole affair in a clear hand, and read it aloud in Meese's saloon. And it is from that reading that the counting of the 9 comes down, because Quirk was a precise man, and he named them all, himself first. He also went out of his way, in that account, to set down the sentence he had spoken in the station yard on the 9th of June about the heart being a muscle that can only be asked to do so much, and to observe that he had seen the muscle in question asked. on the 9th of July, to do rather more than he would have believed possible in any patient of any build, and to remark that a physician who forms an opinion of a person from across a yard has practiced no medicine at all, but has only agreed with the room. The road cut in August was the last public work done at Cadwell Ford for 11 years. After it, a coach came in at the point of the east bank, held the split cottonwood, crossed the bar on hard gravel the whole way over, and came up out of the water on a made grade, and the county maps kept calling the place Cadwell Ford, because county maps do that, and everybody within 40 miles called the gravel Mahala's Bar and the 12-foot dip in the middle of it the Gate. And both of those names were still in use when the last of the people who had been on the bank that morning was dead. That evening, when the passengers had been fed and bedded down in the station, and the horses rubbed, and the arms set, and the town gone home up the bench to talk about it, Mahala Kittredge sat on the kitchen step in a dry dress with her feet in a basin, because 300 feet of gravel, walked barefoot 4 times over, will take the skin off any foot on earth, and her husband came and sat down on the step below her with the lantern and did not say anything for a long while. What he finally said was small and awkward and exactly right, which was that he had been thinking all afternoon about the 4 sentences he had made at the wedding, and about the last one, and that he had been wrong in it, because he had told the town they had not seen her work yet, and the truth was that they had been watching her work every day since the 10th of June and had not known that was what they were looking at. And Mahala said that this was the whole trade, and that her father had said the same thing for 31 years to anybody who would sit still, that the river is not hiding anything, and neither is a person, and the only reason a man is ever surprised by either of them is that he had decided in advance what he was going to see. They were married 41 years. There were 2 children, a son called Absalom for her father, who took the station after Wick Tandy and was a better hand with an account book than either of his parents, and a daughter called Orpha for the woman who had come out of a kitchen door with a pan of water on the 9th of June and thrown it across a yard full of laughing men. Effie Prine went north to her mother on the coach of the 18th of July, when the water had fallen 4 feet and the crossing was hard bottom all the way over, and she came back to Cadwell Ford every summer for 9 years, and married a man in the freighting business, and named her first daughter Mahala, and told the story of the roof, and the cord, and the recitation in the Gate to her grandchildren in the 1930s, by which time there was a steel bridge at the crossing, and nobody under 50 believed a word of it. The copybook that Calvin Ostrander sold for 60 cents and then tore the bill for Field Up in 14 months, and there were 4 more after it, and then a proper ledger the company paid for, and the readings run twice a day in that clear round upright hand from the 10th of June 1878 without a single missed entry until the 4th of March 1919. It is 31 years and rather more, which was the length of her father's record on the Muskingum, and she was aware of that and had meant it, and on the day she passed it she wrote nothing in the margin at all, because it was not the kind of thing she would have written about. The railroad came through in 1887 and put a bridge across the Nettle 11 miles below and took most of the crossing's traffic with it, exactly as a railroad had once taken her father's living, and she went on reading the stake anyway, twice a day, for another 32 years, and when people asked her why she said that the road would come back to the river one day, and somebody would want to know. Somebody did. In 1915, the State Highway Commission sent a young engineer up from the capital to look at a bridge site at Cadwell Ford, and he came to the station and asked whether anybody in the neighborhood could tell him anything about the behavior of that river, and a heavy old woman of 63 in a chair by the window told him to come back in the morning, and put 5 ledgers and 37 years of twice daily stage readings on the kitchen table in front of him at 7 o'clock. Together with the levels she had run in June of 78, with a brass pocket level and a knotted cord, and the record of every rise the Nettle had made in 37 years, with the drift and the color and the answers of 411 drivers to the question of whether it had rained in the high country. The young man sat at that table for 2 days. The abutments of the bridge that was built at Cadwell Ford in 1917 stand where they stand because of that record, and its low cord was set 1.5 feet higher than the original design, and the flood of 1935 went under it with 4 inches to spare and took out 2 other bridges in the same county the same night. She died in the March of 1919 at 67, in the station in the kitchen, and was buried on the bench above the crossing where the ground is high, which was a thing she had asked for and which the whole county understood without needing it explained. Eben Kittredge lived 4 years after her and was buried beside her. The hickory pole with Loyal Hames's iron on the foot of it hung on 2 pegs over the door of the harness room for as long as there was a harness room, and then over the door of a garage, and is now in a case in the county museum at the seat with a card beside it that gets the date of the flood wrong by a year and does not mention the petticoat at all. And the thing to keep hold of at the end is how ordinary the beginning of it was, and how completely everybody got it wrong. 9 men stood in a station yard on a hot morning in June and watched a coach come in and watched a woman get down off it, and in the space of about 40 seconds they decided, all 9 of them, and out loud, and in her hearing, what she was worth and what she was for. They were not monsters. They were a freighter, a smith, a hostler, a storekeeper, a driver, a messenger, a saloon keeper, an agent, and a doctor, which is to say they were the town. And they did the thing towns do, which is to arrive at a verdict from across a yard and then spend a month gathering evidence for it. And 30 days later, every one of the 9 stood on a riverbank in the sunshine and watched the same woman go out into 8 feet of floodwater on a road of stone that only she had trouble to learn, and stand in the worst 12 feet of it with the whole weight of the Nettle River on her back, while 4 grown people and a child and a broken driver passed across her body one at a time to thee. Bank, and then go back and do it again for 4 horses and the mail. They had looked at her and seen a size. What was standing in front of them the whole time in a brown calico dress with the sleeves turned back was the only person within 400 miles who knew where the bottom was.